For 97 years, the entrance to the Black Hollow mine remained sealed beneath a wall of concrete, stone, and rotting timber at the base of a mountain that most people in the surrounding towns had learned to ignore. Trees had grown over the old access road, sections of railway had disappeared beneath mud and roots, and the small settlement that once housed hundreds of miners had been reduced to scattered foundations hidden among the forest. According to the story repeated for generations, there was nothing mysterious about what had happened there. In October of 1928, engineers supposedly detected dangerous movement inside the mountain. The workers were evacuated, and the company decided that reopening the mine would be too risky. Within weeks, families left their homes, equipment was abandoned, the railway stopped running, and Black Hollow vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. It was remembered as another mining town defeated by geology, economics, and time. There was only one problem with that explanation. Almost none of it matched the evidence that survived. There was no newspaper report describing a major collapse at Black Hollow. There was no official list of miners killed or injured. Geological surveys from the period contained no reference to the catastrophic instability the company claimed had forced hundreds of people to leave. Even stranger, former workers occasionally told their families that the evacuation had happened without warning. Men had entered the mountain expecting an ordinary shift and had been ordered back outside only hours later. They were not permitted to retrieve tools, clothing, lunch containers, or personal belongings. Armed company guards appeared near the entrance before sunset, and by the following morning nobody except a small group of supervisors was allowed underground. 3 days later, the company announced that Black Hollow would never reopen. Heavy materials were transported to the mountain, and instead of simply locking the entrance, workers spent weeks constructing a permanent barrier across it. Whatever management feared, they apparently wanted to make certain that nobody could easily return. For decades, those contradictions attracted little attention, because almost everyone who had worked at Black Hollow eventually died, and the documents that might have explained the closure seemed to have disappeared with the company. Then an amateur historian discovered a notebook belonging to a miner named Thomas Bell. Most of Bell's notes were completely ordinary: wages, equipment numbers, lengths of railway track, names of co-workers, and reminders about repairs. But during the final weeks before Black Hollow closed, his writing changed. He repeatedly mentioned a restricted area called Section 14, even though no surviving company map showed that such a section had ever existed. He described guards being placed at an underground junction, crates being carried into the mountain after normal working hours, and a group of miners being selected for work that nobody else was permitted to observe. Then, on October 16, 1928, one day before the entire mine was suddenly evacuated, Bell wrote a sentence that transformed an old industrial ruin into a mystery. They found the chamber behind the east wall. Almost a century later, that sentence led a small group back to Black Hollow. After locating a narrow opening created by decades of erosion beside the original concrete seal, they entered the mine carrying modern lights, surveying equipment, cameras, and copies of the surviving maps. At first, everything underground seemed consistent with a mine abandoned in a hurry. Rusted carts remained on sections of track. Tools lay beside collapsed wooden supports. Metal lunch containers and damaged lamps rested exactly where workers appear to have left them in 1928. But approximately half a mile inside the mountain, the explorers reached a junction that should not have existed. Directly ahead was a narrow passage absent from every official map produced after the mine closed. Above it, almost invisible beneath layers of dirt and mineral deposits, was a faded number painted onto an old wooden beam: 14. They followed the forgotten tunnel deeper into the mountain until the railway ended and the walls narrowed around them. Eventually their lights revealed what appeared at first to be a natural obstruction, but the closer they came, the clearer the truth became. Stones had been deliberately stacked from floor to ceiling and fixed together with mortar. A man-made wall had been constructed across the tunnel, and embedded near its center was a corroded metal plate carrying a single date: October 1928. The barrier had not been created by collapse. Someone had built it during the final days of Black Hollow. More disturbing still, behind a fallen support nearby, they discovered a metal container holding damaged company documents and a list containing the names of 23 miners. At the bottom of the page, beneath the names, someone had written instruction: East Crew, no surface disclosure. That was when the old story finally began to fall apart. Black Hollow had not simply been abandoned because the mountain became unsafe. Before sealing the entrance, someone had first gone deep underground and deliberately sealed one particular section of the mine. Then they removed Section 14 from the maps, emptied the settlement, closed the company, and allowed nearly a century to pass without revealing what had happened there. The explorers now stood directly in front of the wall that generations had never known existed. Beyond it was a chamber that had remained untouched since 1928, containing equipment, documents, and evidence left behind during the final hours of the mine. And when they eventually learned why that chamber had been hidden, they discovered that the greatest secret of Black Hollow was not what the miners had found beneath the mountain. It was what the company had done after finding it. There are places that disappear because nature slowly takes them back, and there are places that seem to have been deliberately erased. Black Hollow belonged to the second category. For most of the 20th century, anyone searching for settlement would have found little more than a name buried in old census records and occasional references in regional newspapers. There were no monuments explaining what had happened there, no preserved buildings, and no museum dedicated to the hundreds of families who had once called the valley home. Even the road leading toward the mine gradually disappeared beneath vegetation. By the 1960s, people living only a few miles away could drive through surrounding countryside without realizing that an entire industrial community had once existed beyond the trees. Yet between 1906 and 1928, Black Hollow had been anything but forgotten. The mine had provided work for generations of laborers, produced thousands of tons of valuable ore, and transformed an isolated mountain valley into a noisy settlement filled with houses, machinery, railway cars, workshops, children, merchants, and men arriving for shifts at every hour of the day. The Black Hollow Mining Company began operations in the spring of 1906 after prospectors reported promising mineral deposits along the eastern side of the mountain. The first operation was modest. Fewer than 40 men worked there, most of them living in temporary wooden cabins constructed near the entrance. Ore was initially transported by horse-drawn wagons along an unreliable dirt road, and heavy rain could isolate the site for days. But the deposits proved richer than expected. Investors provided additional money, new machinery arrived, and within several years a narrow railway connected Black Hollow with a larger transportation line many miles away. The temporary cabins became permanent houses. A general store opened beside the tracks, followed by a school, a small medical clinic, a boarding house, and eventually a company office built on a hill overlooking the entrance. Photographs from the period show families standing outside freshly painted homes, while smoke rises from industrial buildings behind them. Nothing about those images suggests a settlement approaching disaster. Black Hollow appeared to be building toward a prosperous future. By the early 1920s, the mine had become a complicated underground network extending through multiple levels of the mountain. Men descended through the main passage before spreading into numbered working sections connected by tunnels and railway tracks. Small carts carried broken rock toward the surface while electrical cables powered increasingly sophisticated equipment underground. Expansion happened quickly because every new tunnel seemed to reveal another profitable deposit. Company reports celebrated record production, and newspaper advertisements promised steady employment to experienced miners willing to relocate. Families arrived from neighboring regions, and sometimes from hundreds of miles away. At its height, the settlement's population approached 800 people, making Black Hollow one of the largest communities in the immediate area. Children who had been born there expected to grow up there. Merchants invested in larger buildings. Workers purchased furniture for houses owned by the company because they assumed their jobs would continue for decades. Nobody imagined that within a few years, almost every structure would be empty. The first signs of trouble appeared quietly during the summer of 1928. They were not dramatic enough to alarm most workers. A passage on the eastern side of the mine was temporarily closed. Supervisors described the restriction as routine maintenance, and miners were redirected toward other sections. Underground closures were common, particularly when engineers needed to inspect supports or improve ventilation. So few people questioned the decision. But the eastern passage remained closed longer than expected. Then selected workers were quietly reassigned there. Men from ordinary crews noticed new lengths of railway track being transported toward a restricted area, along with electrical cables, timber, drilling equipment, and wooden crates whose contents were never explained. Most unusual of all, company guards began appearing underground. Their presence immediately attracted attention because there had never been a reason to guard an empty tunnel. The men were not protecting payroll money or explosives. They were positioned at a junction and instructed to prevent unauthorized workers from proceeding east. Rumors spread quickly through the settlement. Some miners believed the company had discovered an unusually valuable deposit and wanted to prevent workers from stealing samples. Others suspected management was secretly extending tunnels beneath land belonging to another company. A few thought engineers had discovered dangerous geological conditions and were trying to reinforce the area without alarming families. None of those explanations fully accounted for what workers began witnessing after dark. Equipment moved underground long after normal shifts ended. A small crew repeatedly entered through the main passage at night and sometimes remained inside until morning. Supervisors who normally spoke openly with experienced miners became unusually secretive. The company's chief engineer, Harold Whitmore, began spending nearly every day underground despite previously delegating routine inspections to assistants. Something important had changed inside Black Hollow, and it seemed to center on an area that older workers remember from the earliest years of the operation. Long before the mine reached its peak, an exploratory passage had been excavated toward the eastern side of the mountain. The tunnel appeared on company diagrams produced between 1908 and 1912, but later maps showed it ending abruptly. According to the explanation passed down among miners, the deposit there had been disappointing, so management abandoned the passage and redirected resources elsewhere. Over time, younger workers barely knew it existed. Yet during the summer of 1928, 16 years after the old passage was supposedly abandoned, engineers returned to it. New supports were installed, debris was removed, and rails were extended along the floor. The work was carried out with surprising urgency. Thomas Bell, who maintained sections of underground track, became one of the few ordinary employees to notice what was happening. Bell was not assigned to the secret crew, but his job required him to move throughout the mine, and he began recording unusual details inside the small notebook he carried during shifts. Bell's entries would eventually become one of the most important surviving records of Black Hollow's final months. On September 9th, he noted that several hundred feet of new rail had been delivered to the Eastern Passage. On September 21st, he described seeing 6 large crates moved underground after midnight. He did not know what they contained, but he recorded that the boxes were accompanied by 2 supervisors rather than ordinary warehouse employees. On October 3rd, Bell wrote that the old East Passage had been reopened even though he believed it had been abandoned since before the First World War. For days later, he mentioned hearing drilling from somewhere beyond the restricted junction. Then came an entry suggesting that whatever the company was searching for had finally been located. On October 16th, Bell wrote that workers had found the chamber behind the east wall. There was no description of the chamber and no explanation of what had been inside. The following day, Black Hollow was evacuated. The speed of the closure was extraordinary. Miners who entered on the morning of October 17th expected a normal shift. Several hours later, supervisors began moving through the tunnels, ordering crews toward the surface. No explosion had occurred. There was no visible emergency. Workers later told relatives that some supervisors themselves appeared confused, suggesting the order had come directly from senior management. By early afternoon, more than 100 miners were gathered outside the entrance waiting for information. They were initially told to remain nearby because operations might resume after inspection. Instead, company officials arrived and ordered everyone away from the mine. Men who asked permission to retrieve personal belongings were refused. Before evening, guards had been placed around the property. The following morning, a short company statement announced that geological movement had created unsafe conditions underground and that operations were temporarily suspended. Temporary became permanent almost immediately. Within 3 days, employees were informed that Black Hollow would never reopen. Final wages were distributed, and families living in company houses were given a limited period to leave. Railway cars arrived to remove valuable machinery from surface buildings, but much of the equipment underground was simply abandoned. That decision made little financial sense. Pumps, carts, electrical components, and tools worth considerable amounts of money remained inside. If management truly believed the problem was temporary instability in one section, the company could have recovered much of that equipment before closing the entrance. Instead, executives behaved as though returning underground was something they wanted to prevent rather than something they hoped to accomplish. Then construction crews arrived. Rather than installing a lock gate across the main entrance, they began building a substantial barrier using timber, stone, and concrete. Local residents watched wagon loads of material travel toward the mountain. The work continued for weeks until the passage had been completely sealed. By the beginning of winter, Black Hollow's entrance looked less like the doorway to a temporarily closed mine and more like something intended never to be open again. Families departed one after another. The school closed. The general store emptied its shelves. Railway service stopped, and sections of track were eventually removed. Houses deteriorated after years without maintenance. Within a generation, the forest began reclaiming streets that had once been crowded with workers and children. The company itself disappeared almost as quickly. Black Hollow Mining Company sold several remaining assets and was formally dissolved within 2 years. Its executives moved elsewhere. Its records were scattered or destroyed, and the mine became an increasingly obscure footnote in regional history. The official explanation survived largely because there was nobody left with enough information to challenge it. A dangerous geological condition had forced the closure. That was the story, and for decades it was accepted without serious investigation. But the mountain preserved evidence that company records did not. Deep beyond the concrete entrance, carts still rested on rails where workers had left them. Tools remained beside unfinished jobs. Section 14 waited behind a junction, erased from official maps. And farther inside, hidden beyond a wall deliberately constructed during the final weeks of 1928, was a chamber containing the documents that Black Hollow's owners had apparently believed would never return to the surface. Nearly 97 years would pass before anyone followed Thomas Bell's final clues far enough to find it. By then, the people responsible for closing Black Hollow were long dead. The company no longer existed, and the settlement had almost completely disappeared. But the secret they had buried remained underground, protected not by locks or guards, but by darkness, distance, and the assumption that nobody would ever question the story. All it took to disturb that silence was one old notebook, one forgotten map, and a historian who noticed that a tunnel described by a miner in 1928 had somehow vanished from every official record made afterward. Long before Black Hollow became a forgotten name on deteriorating maps, the valley beneath the mountain was filled with sounds that could be heard from sunrise until well after darkness. Steam whistles announced the beginning and end of shifts. Railway wheels struck the joints between sections of track as loaded cars moved away from the processing buildings. Hammers echoed from repair workshops. Children crossed the main road on their way to the small company school, and every few hours another group of miners disappeared beneath the heavy wooden frame surrounding the entrance. The mountain dominated everything. Houses faced it, roads led toward it, and almost every family in Black Hollow depended on what men were able to remove from inside it. To outsiders, the settlement might have seemed isolated, but to the people who lived there during the prosperous years of the early 1920s, Black Hollow was not a temporary camp. It was home, and many believed it would remain that way for generations. The company encouraged that belief. By 1923, Black Hollow Mining Company had invested heavily in permanent infrastructure. New houses replaced many of the crude cabins built during the mine's earliest years, and employees with families were offered reduced rent as an incentive to remain. A larger school building was constructed near the southern edge of the settlement. The general store expanded, and a physician employed by the company visited the clinic several days each week. Electricity reached most industrial buildings before it reached many nearby rural communities. Photographs taken during company celebrations show long tables arranged outside the administrative building, workers standing beside polished machinery, and children posing beneath banners praising another year of record production. The photographs were intended to demonstrate prosperity to investors, but they also reveal how completely the settlement had organized itself around the expectation that the mine would continue operating. Among the men who understood Black Hollow better than most was Thomas Bell. He had arrived in the valley as a young worker and eventually became responsible for maintaining sections of the narrow underground railway. His job was less dramatic than drilling or blasting, but gave an unusual familiarity with the mine, or carts depended on reliable track. And when rails shifted, supports failed, or water damaged a section passage, Bell was often sent to inspect the problem. Over 11 years, he learned the network almost from memory. He knew where water collected after heavy rain, where ceilings were unusually low, where abandoned tools had been left years earlier, and which tunnels older miners avoided because the timber supports creaked when carts passed. He also knew that Black Hollow was much larger than the simplified maps displayed inside the administrative office suggested. Mining operations rarely developed according to perfect plans. Passages were started and abandoned. Exploratory shafts produced nothing, and older tunnels were sometimes sealed when engineers redirected crews toward more promising deposits. Black Hollow contained several such forgotten branches. Most were harmless remnants of earlier expansion, and workers rarely discussed them. But the eastern side of the mountain had always carried a different reputation among older miners. During the company's first decade, several exploratory passages had been driven eastward before work suddenly stopped. The official explanation was poor or quality, yet Bell remembered hearing conflicting stories. One retired worker claimed the eastern tunnels flooded repeatedly. Another said the rock there was unusually unstable. A third insisted that management had simply decided the section was not profitable enough to justify continued excavation. Nobody seemed certain because by the time Bell became familiar with the mine, the old eastern passage had been closed for years. That changed in 1928. During an ordinary maintenance shift in late August, Bell noticed fresh marks on rails leading toward the abandoned eastern junction. At first, he assumed another crew had moved equipment to the area temporarily, but several days later he saw workers clearing debris from the old passage. The men were not part of the normal maintenance crew. Most had been selected from experienced drilling teams, and they were supervised directly by engineers. Bell asked one of them why the company was reopening a tunnel everyone believed worthless. The miner shrugged and said management had ordered them to inspect an old geological survey. He seemed genuinely unaware of anything unusual. Bell probably would have forgotten the conversation if guards had not appeared at the junction shortly afterward. The first guard was a company employee named Walter Pike, a large man normally assigned to surface security near the warehouse. Seeing him hundreds of feet underground immediately attracted attention. Pike stood beside the entrance to the eastern passage and checked the names of anyone attempting to enter. Within days, a second guard joined him. Ordinary miners were instructed to use alternate routes, even when doing so added considerable time to their work. Supervisors refused to explain the restriction. The situation became a favorite subject of conversation during meal breaks. Some workers joked that the company had discovered gold. Others believed management had found a rival company's tunnel crossing beneath the property. A few suggested something valuable had been hidden there years earlier. The rumors were entertaining precisely because nobody expected them to matter. Black Hollow was prosperous. Production was high, and there was no reason to imagine that whatever was happening in one forgotten passage could threaten the future of the entire settlement. Then the nighttime deliveries began. Bell lived close enough to the railway siding to hear cars being moved after normal operations slowed. During September, several shipments arrived without the usual paperwork being distributed among ordinary warehouse crews. Wooden crates were transferred directly to company wagons and taken toward the mine. Bell saw one shipment while returning from an evening repair. 6 crates stood beside the entrance, each large enough to require several men to move. Their sides carried no obvious markings. 2 engineers supervised while workers loaded them onto underground carts. Bell recognized one of the engineers as Harold Whitmore, the senior technical authority at Black Hollow. Whitmore rarely supervised basic transportation work. The fact that he was personally standing beside anonymous crates after midnight suggested that whatever they contained was important enough to keep outside normal company procedures. Whitmore's behavior changed noticeably during those weeks. He began spending longer periods underground and sometimes remained in Section 14 for entire shifts. Meals were carried to him rather than taken in the administrative building. Assistants moved constantly between his office and the Eastern Passage carrying folders and rolled diagrams. On at least 2 occasions, Bell saw Whitmore arguing quietly with Mine Superintendent Charles Harlan near the entrance. Neither man noticed him at first. Bell could not hear every word, but he remembered one phrase clearly enough to record it later. Whitmore told Harlan that they needed to stop until the measurements are confirmed. Harlan responded that the directors had already approved continued work. The conversation ended when both men realized another employee was nearby. During the first week of October, the restricted operation expanded. Additional timber was transported east, along with electrical cable and sections of track. Bell was ordered to repair a switch near the guarded junction, but was explicitly told not to proceed beyond it. While working there, he heard drilling coming from far inside the old passage. The rhythm continued for several minutes, stopped, then began again. It sounded less like normal production work than careful exploratory drilling. Later that afternoon, a cart emerged carrying broken rock. Bell noticed the material looked different from the ore usually removed from Black Hollow. Before he could examine it closely, a supervisor ordered the cart directly toward a storage building rather than the processing facility. Again, the material seemed to be bypassing ordinary company procedures. What Bell could not know was that management had become interested in an anomaly discovered on an old engineering diagram. Years earlier, surveyors had recorded a narrow void beyond the eastern excavation, but nobody had established whether it was a natural cavity or simply an error in measurements. The notation had been forgotten when the passage was abandoned. In 1928, while reviewing old surveys in preparation for further expansion, engineers rediscovered it. The company believed the void might indicate another mineral-bearing formation, and executives authorized a small crew to reopen the passage. At first, the decision was purely economic. Black Hollow was profitable, but deeper extraction was becoming more expensive. A significant new deposit could extend the life of the operation for many years. That possibility was enough to justify secrecy, particularly if management feared competitors might learn about the discovery before additional property rights could be secured. The miners working in Section 14 advanced slowly through rock that had not been disturbed in years. Old supports were replaced, rails extended, and ventilation improved. Then, during the second week of October, drilling produced an unexpected result. A worker operating near the eastern wall noticed that the sound of his tool changed dramatically across a narrow section of stone. Instead of the dense resistance expected from solid rock, the wall seemed thinner. Engineers were called. Measurements were taken. Whitmore ordered the crew to stop while he compared a location with the old survey. The mysterious void lay directly beyond them. The following morning, a limited number of workers were instructed to remove the remaining rock carefully rather than blast through it. Shortly before noon, part of the wall gave way. Dust moved through the opening, followed by a current of cold air from a space that should not have existed. The men widened the gap enough to shine lamps through it. Their lights did not strike another wall immediately. Instead, they disappeared into darkness. The miners had reached a chamber extending beyond the known excavation. What surprised Whitmore was not simply its size. The surfaces visible near the opening carried marks that did not resemble natural fractures. Sections appeared to have been worked before Black Hollow's crew reached them. Someone at some unknown point had already disturbed the interior of the mountain. Work stopped while Whitmore entered with 2 supervisors. They remained inside for nearly an hour. When they returned, the opening was covered temporarily with timber, and the crew was told not to discuss what they had seen. Guards at the Section 14 junction were given new instructions. Nobody entered without written authorization. The 23 workers associated with the Eastern crew were called individually into the administrative building over the next 2 days. Some returned to work without explanation. Others appeared uneasy and refused to answer questions from friends. Rumors spread beyond the mine and into the settlement. Wives heard fragments from husbands. Children repeated conversations they did not understand. Merchants noticed company officials arriving by automobile from outside the valley. Something had been found beneath Black Hollow, and for the first time the secrecy surrounding Section 14 no longer seemed like ordinary corporate caution. Thomas Bell watched the changes carefully. On October 15th, he saw Whitmore leave the mine looking exhausted and carrying several rolled maps beneath one arm. Later that evening, a special train brought 3 men who were believed to represent company ownership. They went directly to the administrative building and remained there long after midnight. The following morning, Bell was sent underground to inspect a damaged section of track several hundred feet from the Eastern Junction. He again saw guards at Section 14, but this time nobody appeared to be entering or leaving. The drilling had stopped completely. As Bell prepared to return toward the surface, one of the Eastern crew passed him and quietly mentioned that management had suspended all work beyond the wall. Bell asked what they had found. The miner hesitated before answering. He looked toward the guard and lowered his voice. "A chamber," he said. "Something that shouldn't be there." Bell recorded the conversation that evening. His entry was brief because he apparently knew little more than what he had been told. Beneath the date October 16th, 1928, he wrote the line that would survive long after Black Hollow itself had disappeared. They found the chamber behind the east wall. The next morning, Bell returned to work expecting to learn more. Instead, before the shift was halfway over, every miner in Black Hollow was ordered to leave the mountain. Men abandoned tools beside unfinished jobs and followed supervisors toward the surface. Carts remained loaded on rails. Electrical equipment was left running until someone cut power from outside. No explanation was provided underground. By the time Bell emerged into daylight, company officials were already gathering near the entrance. Guards prevented anyone from going back inside, and rumors moved through the crowd faster than management could control them. Whatever had happened during the previous 48 hours had changed everything. The company that had spent years expanding Black Hollow suddenly wanted every worker out. The mine that executives had expected to operate for decades was about to be abandoned in a matter of days. And somewhere beyond the guarded Eastern Junction, the newly discovered chamber remained in darkness, containing something important enough that the people who controlled Black Hollow were willing to sacrifice an entire operation rather than allow ordinary workers to return and see it. The morning of October 17th, 1928, began like hundreds of mornings before it. Long before sunrise, lights appeared in the windows of Black Hollow as families prepared for another working day. Men walked toward the mine carrying metal lunch containers and lamps while smoke rose from chimneys across the settlement. The first whistle sounded through the valley, and workers gathered near the entrance before disappearing underground in groups. According to surviving payroll records, 143 miners were scheduled for that shift, along with engineers, supervisors, and maintenance workers. Thomas Bell entered shortly after 6 in the morning and began his normal inspection of several railway sections. Nothing at the surface suggested that within hours every one of those men would be ordered out and that none of them would ever work inside Black Hollow again. The only unusual detail was the atmosphere surrounding Section 14. The guards remained at the Eastern Junction, but the activity Bell had observed during previous weeks had stopped. No drilling could be heard. No carts moved toward the restricted passage. Workers assigned in nearby sections noticed several supervisors traveling repeatedly between the junction and the surface. Around 8 in the morning, Chief Engineer Harold Whitmore arrived underground carrying a leather case and accompanied by Mine Superintendent Charles Harlan. The 2 men entered Section 14 and remained there for more than an hour. When they returned, witnesses later remembered that Whitmore appeared angry, while Harlan seemed determined to avoid conversation. They separated without addressing the miners nearby. Whitmore went toward the surface. Harlan remained underground and began speaking privately with section supervisors. Shortly after 10, workers near the eastern side of the mine felt what several described as a faint vibration. It was not violent enough to knock anything loose, and men working farther away noticed nothing at all. Underground miners were accustomed to vibrations caused by drilling, blasting, and shifting equipment, so the sensation initially caused little concern. But there had been no scheduled blasting in that area. A maintenance worker later claimed that one of the engineers immediately returned to Section 14 carrying measuring equipment. Approximately 30 minutes later, another engineer emerged quickly and headed toward the main passage. Nobody sounded an alarm. Nobody shouted that the mine was collapsing. Instead, information moved quietly upward to management while ordinary miners continued working. At 11:20, supervisors received an order to suspend activity in several eastern sections. Workers were told to put down their equipment and wait. 15 minutes later, the instruction changed. Everyone in those sections was to return to the surface. Men assumed there would be a short inspection and began walking toward the main passage without urgency. Then the evacuation expanded. Crews working on the western side, far from Section 14, were also ordered out. Thomas Bell was repairing a rail joint when his supervisor approached and told him to leave everything exactly where it was. Bell asked whether he should collect tools from a nearby storage area. The supervisor refused. "Just go up," he said. "They're clearing the whole place." That was the moment many workers realized something serious was happening. Mines did not stop complete operations without reason. Production schedules were demanding, and every hour underground represented money. Even after minor collapses, unaffected sections often continued operating. Yet, Black Hollow was being emptied from one end to the other. Men moved along the main passage toward daylight, leaving carts, drills, lamps, and personal belongings behind. Some asked supervisors whether there had been a gas problem. Others suspected an electrical failure. Nobody received a clear answer. Several supervisors seemed to know no more than the workers themselves. They had simply been instructed to evacuate. By shortly after noon, a large crowd had formed outside the entrance. Men stood in work clothes waiting for instructions, while families began noticing the unusual activity from their houses. The mine whistle had sounded at an unexpected hour, and women came toward the road to see what had happened. Rumors spread immediately. One miner said part of the eastern tunnel had collapsed. Another claimed engineers had detected poisonous gas. Someone else insisted there had been an underground fire. Yet there was no smoke, no rescue crew entered, and no injured workers were brought outside. The absence of an obvious emergency made the situation more confusing. If the mountain was dangerous enough to evacuate, why were senior officials still moving in and out of the entrance? Around 1 in the afternoon, Whitmore returned underground with Harlan and 4 selected employees. They remained inside for approximately 40 minutes. When they emerged, Whitmore carried the same leather case he had taken underground earlier. One worker remembered seeing dust covering his coat and a tear along one sleeve. He walked directly toward the administrative building without speaking. Harlan ordered guards to prevent miners from re-entering. Men protested that coats, watches, and personal equipment remained below. Several had left lunch containers near their work areas. One worker had medication stored in a locker underground. All requests were denied. The restriction was absolute. Shortly before 2, 3 automobiles arrived from outside Black Hollow. They carried senior company representatives, including at least one director who rarely visited the operation. The men entered the administrative building, where a meeting began behind closed doors. Whitmore, Harlan, and several engineers joined them. For almost 2 hours, workers remained outside without information. Some eventually returned home, assuming the shift was finished. Others stayed because they expected the mine to reopen before evening. Bell remained near the railway workshop and watched messengers moving between the office and entrance. He later recorded that guards had been placed not only at the mine, but also near the company records building. Inside the office, the discussion was becoming increasingly tense. Documents discovered decades later would reveal that Whitmore had completed new measurements inside Section 14 that morning. The faint vibration workers felt had not caused a crisis by itself. It confirmed something engineers had already begun to suspect. Portions of the eastern excavation had been weakened by previous mining activity, including work that did not appear accurately on official plans. Several major support structures have been altered or removed during earlier attempts to reach deposits beyond the approved boundary. The newly discovered chamber made the situation even more complicated because it exposed evidence that underground activity extended into areas the company did not legally control. Whitmore's recommendation was immediate suspension of all eastern operations, followed by a full engineering investigation. But company directors faced a larger problem. A legitimate investigation would require updated maps and access to Section 14. Inspectors would see tunnels omitted from official records. They would discover that Black Hollow had extracted material beyond its authorized boundaries, and that internal warnings about structural risks had been ignored. If those facts became public, the company could face lawsuits from neighboring landowners, government penalties, and potentially criminal accusations against senior management. Even worse, if instability eventually caused a major collapse after executives had been warned, the consequences could be catastrophic. The directors needed time, but they also needed silence. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, the meeting ended. Superintendent Harlan stepped outside and addressed a group of workers still waiting near the entrance. He announced that unusual geological movement had been detected and that Black Hollow would remain closed while engineers evaluated conditions. Workers were told to return home and wait for further instructions. Harlan emphasized that nobody had been injured and there was no immediate danger to the settlement. His statement temporarily calmed many families. Mines occasionally closed for inspections. Most assumed operations would resume within days. Thomas Bell was less convinced. He had seen the reopening of the Eastern Passage. He knew about the guards, the nighttime deliveries, and the chamber discovered the previous day. Now the entire mine had been evacuated immediately afterward. Bell returned home and wrote in his notebook. His entry that evening was longer than usual. He recorded the evacuation, the arrival of company directors, and the refusal to allow workers back underground. Then he added a short observation. They say movement. Nobody heard a fall. Eastmen won't talk. The following morning brought the first sign that the closure would not be temporary. Before sunrise, additional guards arrived from outside the settlement. They were positioned around the entrance and administrative buildings. Workers who approached expecting another shift were turned away. Company employees began collecting records from several offices and placing them inside wooden crates. A train arrived shortly after 9, carrying no cars, but several empty freight cars. Surface machinery was inventoried. The warehouse stopped distributing supplies. The general store manager received notice that company credit for miners had been suspended until further notice. By afternoon, fear had replaced curiosity. Black Hollow existed because of the mine. If operations remained closed for weeks, almost every household would lose its income. Groups of workers gathered outside the company office demanding information. Management refused to provide details beyond the statement about geological instability. Some men suggested contacting state mining inspectors independently, but others feared doing so might delay reopening. Company officials encouraged patience and promised an announcement soon. The announcement came on October 20th. Black Hollow Mining Company declared that engineering assessments had identified conditions making continued operation economically and physically impractical. The mine would close permanently. Employees would receive final wages, and families occupying company housing would be given a limited period to relocate. The decision stunned the settlement. 3 days earlier, Black Hollow had been operating at nearly full capacity. There had been no disaster, no major decline in production, and no public warning of financial trouble. Now hundreds of people were being told that the community around them effectively had no future. Anger spread quickly. Workers demanded to see the engineering report. Management refused, claiming technical documents were confidential. Several experienced miners questioned how the company could complete a comprehensive structural assessment in less than 72 hours without allowing ordinary crews underground. Others wanted to recover personal belongings. Again, permission was denied. Company officials said conditions could deteriorate unpredictably and entering would expose workers to unnecessary danger. Yet during those same days, selected supervisors continued making brief trips underground. Those final trips focused almost entirely on Section 14. Small groups entered carrying boxes, tools, and construction materials. They did not remove valuable equipment. Instead, they transported stone, mortar, and timber toward the Eastern Passage. Work continued away from the ordinary workforce, and guards prevented anyone from observing it. Deep inside the mountain, beyond the point where the railway ended, a barrier began rising across the tunnel leading to the newly discovered chamber. The construction was deliberate and substantial. Stones were stacked from one wall to the other and secured with mortar. A metal plate bearing the month and year was fixed near the center. Whatever documents or equipment remained inside the chamber would be inaccessible without physically breaking through the barrier. When the work was complete, supervisors withdrew from Section 14. Then records identifying the passage began disappearing from company files. A map dated earlier in 1928 showed faint references to the eastern expansion. A revised version prepared after the closure did not. Section numbers ended at 13. The old eastern passage appeared abandoned and incomplete. Anyone studying the official plans years later would have no reason to believe another working section had existed. Section 14 had effectively been removed from Black Hollow's documented history, but management was not finished. During November, construction crews began sealing the main entrance. Residents who had not yet left watched loads of stone, timber, and cement arrive at the mountain. Some assumed the company was preventing children or curious residents from entering an unsafe mine. That explanation was reasonable, but the scale of the barrier surprised experienced workers. The entrance was not simply boarded shut. It was reinforced until reopening would require significant effort and equipment. Thomas Bell watched the work from a distance. By then, he was preparing to leave Black Hollow with his family. He had found temporary employment elsewhere, as had many former miners. Before departing, he made one final note about the mine. The sentence was written beneath several calculations concerning travel expenses and wages, almost hidden among ordinary details of a family forced to start over. The mountain didn't close the mine. They did. Bell left Black Hollow before winter. Within months, most families followed. The whistle never sounded again. The school closed. The store emptied. Houses were abandoned one after another. Vegetation began spreading across paths that had once carried hundreds of workers toward the entrance each morning. The company that built the settlement gradually disappeared, and the official explanation hardened into history. Geological instability had forced Black Hollow to close. Almost everyone eventually accepted it. But behind the sealed entrance, half a mile inside the mountain, another wall stood across a tunnel that official maps insisted had never existed. On one side were the abandoned passages of Black Hollow. On the other were the chamber, the forgotten records, and the evidence that company officials had spent their final days trying to isolate. And for the next 97 years, nobody would cross that wall. For decades after Black Hollow closed, Thomas Bell's notebook remained inside an ordinary cardboard box that nobody considered important. Bell himself rarely spoke about the mine after leaving the valley. Like many former workers, he had been forced to rebuild his life quickly. He found employment at another industrial operation several hundred miles away, rented a small house for his family, and eventually settled into a routine that had little connection with the mountain where he had spent 11 years underground. His children remembered hearing occasional stories about Black Hollow, but they were usually simple memories of hard work, difficult winters, and the people who had lived in the settlement. Bell never presented himself as someone carrying a great secret. If he believed the company had hidden something in 1928, he apparently decided there was little he could do about it. Black Hollow Mining Company no longer existed. The executives responsible for the closure had scattered, and the workers who might have supported his suspicions were busy trying to survive the economic uncertainty that followed. Bell died many years later without publishing his notes or contacting historians. His possessions were divided among relatives, and the small notebook eventually passed to his daughter, then to his granddaughter, Margaret Bell. It remained with old photographs, employment papers, letters, receipts, and several objects from his years as a miner. Margaret knew the box existed, but had little reason to examine it closely. To her, Black Hollow was simply part of family history, a place her grandfather had worked before she was born. The notebook might have remained forgotten permanently if she had not decided, decades later, to organize family documents before moving to a smaller house. One afternoon, she began sorting the contents of the box and found several photographs showing a settlement she could not identify. In one, Thomas Bell stood beside 3 other miners near a railway cart. Behind them was the wooden frame of the Black Hollow entrance. On the back, someone had written a date, May 1926. Curiosity led Margaret to search for information about the mine. She found almost nothing. A few digitized newspaper articles mentioned production figures and company announcements, while an old census confirmed that hundreds of people had once lived in the settlement. The closure was summarized in only a few lines. Geological instability had made continued mining unsafe in October 1928. Operations ceased permanently. The settlement declined soon afterward. There was no mention of an accident, no investigation described, and no explanation for why such productive mine had been abandoned so quickly. Margaret found the absence strange, but not necessarily suspicious. Industrial communities disappeared frequently during that period, and many companies left incomplete records. She placed the photographs aside and continued sorting. Then she opened her grandfather's notebook. Most of the pages initially seemed meaningless. Bell had written measurements, names, repair schedules, and lists of equipment in small handwriting. Several pages contained calculations involving rail lengths and replacement parts. Margaret considered throwing it away, but near the back she noticed a series of dated entries from September and October 1928. The tone was different. Her grandfather had begun recording observations rather than routine work details. He mentioned guards underground, late-night deliveries, and a reopened Eastern Passage. One entry referred to Section 14. Another described a disagreement between company officials. Then Margaret reached October 16th and read the sentence about the chamber behind the east wall. She did not understand what it meant, but she understood that it was unusual. Years passed before the notebook reached someone capable of connecting those entries with surviving mining records. That person was Daniel Mercer, an amateur industrial historian who had spent much of his adult life documenting abandoned railways, factories, and mining settlements. Daniel was not searching for treasure or supernatural stories. His interest was historical reconstruction. He enjoyed comparing old maps with modern landscapes and identifying structures that had vanished beneath forests, reservoirs, and expanding towns. Black Hollow first attracted his attention because of an old railway map showing a branch line that appeared to terminate in empty wilderness. When he investigated further, he discovered that the line had once served a mining settlement that disappeared after 1928. Daniel expected the research to be straightforward. Instead, every document seemed to create another question. Production reports from 1927 indicated that Black Hollow remained profitable. Employment numbers had been stable. Company advertisements published only months before the closure were still recruiting experienced miners. There was no obvious financial collapse. Yet in October 1928, operations stopped almost instantly. Daniel searched newspaper archives for reports of a major accident and found none. He looked for geological surveys describing a catastrophic failure and found only vague references based on the company's own statement. Even regional mining reports treated the closure as surprisingly abrupt. The deeper Daniel searched, the more unusual the timeline became. On October 17th, workers were evacuated. On October 20th, the company announced permanent closure. Within weeks, the entrance was being sealed. Within 2 years, the company itself had dissolved. There was no prolonged attempt to stabilize the mine, no sale to another operator, and apparently no serious effort to recover expensive equipment left underground. From a business perspective, abandoning a productive operation that quickly seemed irrational unless management believed reopening created a greater risk than losing the mine entirely. Daniel began searching for descendants of Black Hollow workers, hoping family collections might contain photographs or letters. Most leads went nowhere. Nearly a century had passed, and many families had lost documents during moves or after relatives died. Eventually, a local historical society placed a short notice online asking anyone connected with Black Hollow to contact Daniel. Margaret Bell saw it several months later. She sent a message explaining that her grandfather had worked there and that she possessed a notebook containing several references to mine's final weeks. When Daniel first examined the notebook, he expected another collection of personal memories. Instead, the entry mentioning Section 14 immediately caught his attention. Every official Black Hollow map he had found showed 13 working sections. He checked again. Sections 1 through 13 were clearly marked, but there was number 14. Daniel initially considered the possibility that Bell had used an informal name for an area of the mine, yet additional entries made that explanation difficult. Bell described rails being delivered specifically to Section 14 and guards controlling access to it. This sounded like an organized company operation, not a nickname used by workers. The entry about the old East Passage created another problem. Daniel returned to earlier maps and noticed that diagrams produced before 1913 showed a narrow exploratory tunnel extending eastward. Later versions either shortened it or removed details entirely. According to one engineering note, work there had been discontinued because further excavation was considered uneconomical. That matched the story Bell had apparently heard. But if the passage had been abandoned in the early years, why had the company reopened it in 1928, immediately before closing the entire mine? Daniel began placing the maps chronologically across a large table. When viewed individually, none seemed remarkable. Together, they revealed subtle changes. The eastern side of Black Hollow became progressively less detailed over time. A passage shown clearly in 1911 became a faint line in 1917. By 1924, only its beginning remained. On the final official plan, it appeared to terminate not far from the main network. Yet Bell's notebook claimed workers had installed hundreds of feet of rail there only weeks before the closure. Either Bell's notes were wrong, or the official map was intentionally incomplete. Then Daniel found a document that shifted the investigation dramatically. While examining railway engineering files stored in a regional archive, he discovered a folded mining diagram that had apparently been included by mistake with records concerning freight capacity. The document was damaged along the edges and lacked a clear date, but Black Hollow was written across the top. Daniel carefully unfolded it and recognized a familiar network of tunnels. On the eastern side, however, a pencil line extended far beyond the boundary shown on later company maps. Beside the line was a small handwritten number. For the first time, Daniel had independent evidence that Thomas Bell's mysterious section had actually existed. The diagram contained another detail. Near the end of the eastern passage, someone had drawn a small irregular shape and marked it with a question mark. No explanation accompanied it. Daniel compared the diagram with Bell's notebook. The location seemed consistent with the passage Bell said had been reopened. If the map represented an early survey, engineers may have detected some kind of underground void years before workers physically reached it. Perhaps that was the chamber mentioned in Bell's final entry. Daniel wanted to know when the diagram had been created. Paper analysis and surrounding documents suggested it likely dated from the mine's early period, possibly between 1910 and 1913. That meant the mysterious shape could have been known to company engineers for more than a decade before the 1928 operation. Why they waited so long to investigate it remained unclear. Black Hollow's rapid expansion during the 1920s might have changed the economics. As easily accessible deposits declined, management may have returned to older surveys looking for overlooked opportunities. The eastern anomaly could have represented a possible extension of valuable mineral formations, but that still did not explain the secrecy. Mining companies protected information about promising deposits, but guards stationed underground and late-night deliveries suggested unusual concern. More importantly, once the chamber was reached, the company did not exploit whatever was there. It closed the entire operation the following day. Daniel spent months searching for documents associated with Harold Whitmore, Black Hollow's chief engineer. He discovered that Whitmore left mining shortly after the closure and moved to another state. His professional record before 1928 was extensive. After Black Hollow, it became strangely quiet. He never again held a comparable engineering position. An obituary published decades later mentioned his early career, but omitted Black Hollow entirely. Daniel located descendants, but found no surviving technical papers. Superintendent Charles Harlan followed a different path. He joined another mining company within a year, eventually becoming an executive. Interviews published later in his career discussed several operations he had managed, but again Black Hollow was barely mentioned. When asked in one old newspaper profile why he had left his previous employer, Harlan reportedly described the closure as an unfortunate geological problem. Nothing more. The 23 men assigned to Section 14 were harder to trace. Daniel used payroll records, census documents, and family archives to reconstruct their movements. What he discovered was remarkable. Most left the region within weeks of the mine's closure. Several found work at distant mines. 2 moved across the country. 1 apparently left mining entirely. There was no evidence that any publicly discussed the chamber. That silence could have been coincidence. Workers displaced by a closed mine naturally moved wherever jobs existed. But Bell's notebook contained a troubling entry from October 18th. East crew called separately. Harlan says agreements. Agreements? Daniel could not prove what Bell meant, but the possibility was obvious. The company might have required the Section 14 crew to sign confidentiality agreements before receiving final wages or additional compensation. Such arrangements would help explain why stories about the chamber never became part of local folklore, despite more than 20 men apparently knowing it existed. By 2024, Daniel had accumulated enough evidence to believe the official history of Black Hollow was incomplete. He still did not know what the company had discovered or why it had abandoned the mine, but he could establish several facts. Section 14 existed. It had been omitted from later maps. Workers reopened an old eastern passage shortly before the closure. Guards restricted access. A chamber was discovered on October 16th. The entire mine was evacuated on October 17th. And afterward, management prevented ordinary miners from returning underground. There was one final piece of Bell's notebook that Daniel kept returning to. It appeared several pages after the evacuation entry, mixed among calculations concerning his family's relocation. Bell wrote that construction materials had been taken underground after workers were dismissed. He specifically mentioned stone and cement. At the time, Bell assumed the company was reinforcing unstable areas. But Daniel now wondered whether those materials had another purpose. If Black Hollow was already being abandoned, why would the company spend money constructing something deep inside a mine nobody intended to reopen? The answer seemed obvious enough to make Daniel uncomfortable. They were not reinforcing Section 14. They were sealing it. Nearly a century after Thomas Bell walked away from Black Hollow, his small notebook had reconstructed a path through the mountain that official records had erased. Daniel now knew approximately where the forgotten tunnel should begin and, using the old engineering diagram, roughly where it should end. What he did not know was whether any of it remained accessible. The main entrance had been sealed since 1928, and decades of erosion, flooding, and structural deterioration could have destroyed large portions of the underground network. For months, Daniel resisted the idea of physically entering the site. An abandoned mine was not a historical archive with shelves and labeled boxes. It was an unstable industrial structure where rotten supports, hidden shafts, bad air, and collapsing rock could turn curiosity into disaster. Any attempt would require careful planning, experienced assistance, and proper authorization. But every document he found eventually led back to the same place: the eastern side of Black Hollow, Section 14, and the chamber Thomas Bell mentioned only once. In the spring of 2025, Daniel returned to the valley with copies of the old maps and Bell's notebook. Almost nothing remained of the settlement. Trees stood where houses once lined the road. Concrete foundations disappeared beneath leaves. A rusted section of rail emerged from the ground before vanishing again under roots. He followed the terrain toward the base of the mountain until he reached the area where the mine entrance should have been. At first, he thought he had the wrong location. Then he saw a straight line beneath the vegetation. Concrete. Daniel cleared enough leaves to expose part of the barrier built almost 97 years earlier. Most of it remained intact, but decades of water and movement had damaged the rock along one side. Behind a cluster of fallen stones was a narrow gap. Cold air was moving through it. Somewhere beyond that opening lay the abandoned tracks, the tools workers never recovered, and the junction where Thomas Bell had last seen the guards of Section 14. And if the forgotten diagram was correct, farther inside the mountain there was another wall, one the company had never told anyone about. Finding the damaged entrance did not mean Daniel Mercer was ready to enter Black Hollow. The narrow opening beside the old concrete barrier was proof that the interior had not been completely isolated from the outside world, but also demonstrated how much the mountain had changed during 97 years of abandonment. Water had moved through cracks, roots had forced themselves between stones, and repeated winters had weakened sections of exposed rock. Daniel understood that the greatest mistake he could make was treating the mine like an ordinary abandoned building. Beneath the mountain there would be no reliable phone signal, no easy route around a collapsed passage, and no guarantee that wooden supports installed before his grandparents were born could still carry the weight above them. He photographed the entrance, recorded its approximate position, and left without going farther. If Black Hollow was going to be explored, it would have to be done carefully and with people who understood underground environments. Over the following months, Daniel assembled a small team and continued reconstructing the mine on paper. The most experienced member was Michael Reeves, a former mining engineer who had spent decades inspecting underground operations before retirement. Michael initially dismissed the Black Hollow mystery as an interesting example of incomplete historical records. Old mines frequently contain passages absent from surviving maps, and companies did not always preserve every revision. When Daniel showed him Thomas Bell's notebook and the early diagram marked with Section 14, however, Michael became more interested. What bothered him was not simply that one tunnel had disappeared from later records. It was a sequence of events surrounding that disappearance. A company had reopened an old passage, restricted access, discovered chamber, evacuated an otherwise productive mine the next day, sealed the operation, and then produced maps that no longer showed the new section. Any one of those details could have an ordinary explanation. Together, they suggested deliberate concealment. Michael began comparing the surviving diagrams more carefully. He enlarged digital copies and aligned fixed points, such as the main entrance, major intersections, and ventilation passages. Most sections matched surprisingly well. The eastern side did not. On the 1926 map, a branch ended approximately 1,900 feet from the entrance. On the older engineering diagram, a faint line continued several hundred feet beyond that point before reaching the shape marked with question mark. Bell's notebook suggested that new rail had been installed in precisely that direction during September 1928. Michael calculated that if the passage still existed, the beginning of Section 14 should be located beyond a junction on the mine's second main level. The route was theoretically straightforward. In practice, nobody knew what 97 years had done to it. Another member of the group, historian Rebecca Shaw, concentrated on property records. She discovered that Black Hollow Mining Company had purchased rights to a large portion of the mountain, but did not own all the land above the eastern extension. A neighboring tract belonged to a family that had repeatedly refused to sell during the 1910s and 1920s. This detail introduced a possible explanation for the secrecy. If Section 14 extended beneath property the company did not control, mining there could have exposed Black Hollow to significant legal claims. The company might have hidden the passage simply because it was extracting or illegally. Yet Rebecca found no lawsuit from the neighboring owners and no public accusation that Black Hollow had crossed the property boundary. If illegal excavation had occurred, it apparently remained undiscovered at the time. Then she found a deed recorded in December 1928, less than 2 months after the mine closed. The document transferred a small piece of land near the eastern side of the mountain to an investment company whose directors included 2 men connected to Black Hollow Mining Company. The price was unusually high for property with little obvious surface value. Rebecca could not determine why the transaction occurred after operations had already ended. Perhaps management hoped to secure legal control over underground passages retroactively. Perhaps the land concealed something unrelated to mining. Whatever the reason, it indicated that company executives remained interested in the eastern side of the mountain even after publicly declaring Black Hollow worthless. Daniel returned to the regional archive, searching for additional versions of the mine plan. He eventually found a collection of insurance documents that included a map dated February 1928. This plan was especially important because it had been created only 8 months before the closure. The eastern passage appeared, but unlike the older diagram, it ended at a heavy line accompanied by the notation, "Inactive workings." There was still no Section 14. Daniel placed the February map beside Bell's September entries. Within 7 months, an inactive tunnel had apparently become the center of an intensive secret operation. Something must have convinced management to return. A handwritten memorandum attached to another document offered a clue. It referred to a geological review conducted during the summer of 1928 and mentioned eastern anomaly readings inconsistent with archive survey. The rest of the page concerned equipment purchases and contained no explanation of what those readings were. Michael believed engineers might have detected an underground void using surveying techniques available at the time, or simply noticed that old measurements failed to correspond with the physical dimensions of the mountain. Either way, the company appears to have suspected that something existed beyond the abandoned passage before reopening it. The word chamber in Bell's notebook had encouraged dramatic theories among the few people Daniel told about the research, but Michael repeatedly warned against imagining anything extraordinary. Underground cavities could form naturally. Earlier prospectors might also have excavated part of the mountain before Black Hollow Mining Company arrived. Mining claims in remote regions were often poorly documented, and small 19th century operations sometimes disappeared without detailed records. The chamber could therefore have been nothing more than forgotten human excavation. The real historical mystery was not necessarily the chamber itself. It was why discovering it had apparently triggered such an extreme response from company management. Rebecca searched land records going back before 1906. Several prospectors had filed claims in the broader region during the late 19th century, but none clearly corresponded with the Black Hollow site. One document from 1889 described exploratory work near an eastern ridge, although the coordinates were imprecise. Another referenced a partnership that dissolved after less than a year. No production figure survived. If earlier miners had entered the mountain, they had left almost no paper trail. That possibility made the question mark on the early Black Hollow diagram more intriguing. Engineers might have encountered signs of older excavation during the company's first years and decided not to investigate further until 1928. As the team gathered evidence, Daniel created 3 versions of the underground layout. The first reproduced the official 1926 company map. The second added passages shown on earlier surveys. The third incorporated Bell's descriptions and the mysterious Section 14 diagram. When the 3 were placed together, the difference was dramatic. The public version of Black Hollow was only part of the mine. Several exploratory passages had disappeared from later plans, and Section 14 extended farther east than anything acknowledged in official records. Most importantly, the projected end of the tunnel crossed the company's documented property boundary. Michael calculated distances using surface landmarks still identifiable on historical photographs. According to his estimate, the chamber described by Bell should lie beneath a remote section of hillside approximately half a mile from the main entrance in a straight underground route. The location was not directly beneath any surviving structure. Nothing on the surface indicated a hidden cavity below. There were no shafts, ventilation structures, or collapsed openings. If someone wanted to reach it, the old mine remained the only obvious path. Before attempting entry, the team spent weeks preparing. They reviewed historical ventilation layouts, identified areas most likely to contain vertical shafts, and marked alternate routes where the maps allowed them. They also established a strict point beyond which they would not proceed if conditions became questionable. Their objective was not to force access through unstable sections or disturb sealed areas. Initially, Daniel wanted only to confirm whether Section 14 existed. If they could photograph the numbered junction and compare the physical tunnel with Bell's descriptions, they would already have evidence that the surviving official maps were incomplete. They returned to Black Hollow in early autumn. The forest around the former settlement was dense enough that walking a few hundred yards could erase all sight of modern roads. Daniel led the group past the remains of the company office, where fragments of brick and concrete were barely visible beneath vegetation. They crossed the approximate location of the old railway platform and followed a shallow depression that once carried track toward the mountain. Near the entrance, the air became noticeably cooler. The old concrete seal emerged gradually from behind moss, soil, and fallen branches. The gap Daniel had discovered months earlier remained open. Beyond it was complete darkness. The group stopped outside while Michael examined the surrounding rock. The barrier itself was remarkably substantial. Layers of stone and concrete filled what had once been the main entrance, confirming accounts that the company had invested considerable effort in sealing Black Hollow. The narrow opening had formed where erosion damaged natural rock beside the artificial wall, rather than where the concrete itself failed. Through it, they could see part of the original tunnel several feet beyond. Once conditions near the opening had been assessed, the team entered one at a time. The transition from daylight to darkness was immediate. Within a short distance, the forest outside became only a pale shape behind them. Their lights revealed a tunnel wider than Daniel expected. supported at intervals by heavy timber beams darkened with age. Rusted rails ran along the floor. Water moved slowly through a shallow channel beside them. Mineral deposits covered sections of wall, creating pale streaks that reflected their lamps. The first objects appeared less than 100 yards inside. A metal container lay beside the track, crushed beneath fallen debris. Farther ahead stood the remains of an ore cart, its wheels fused with rust. A shovel rested against the wall, although the wooden handle had largely deteriorated. These were not valuable discoveries, but they gave the mine an unsettling sense of interruption. Black Hollow had not been carefully emptied before closure. Workers really had left equipment where it stood. Daniel thought about October 17, 1928. Men had walked along this same passage toward daylight, without knowing they would never return. Somewhere among them had been Thomas Bell. The group continued slowly, checking the map at every intersection. For the first several hundred yards, the physical mine corresponded closely with the 1926 plan. A western branch appeared exactly where expected. A ventilation passage had partially collapsed but remained identifiable. Numbers painted on support beams matched known sections. Daniel's confidence in the historical maps increased. Then they reached the eastern portion. According to the official map, they should soon encounter a junction with 2 usable passages. The older diagram showed 3. Their lights moved across the tunnel ahead. The first passage appeared on the left. The second curved toward the right. And directly between them, partly hidden behind fallen timber and mineral deposits, was a third opening. Daniel stopped. Michael unfolded the map, even though everyone already understood what they were looking at. On the official plan, there was solid rock directly ahead. No passage, no exploratory line, nothing. But the tunnel was there. The entrance was narrower than the main workings and appeared to have been reinforced later than the surrounding area. Electrical brackets remained attached to one wall, and sections of rail continued into darkness. Near the top of the opening, a wooden beam crossed from wall to wall. Layers of dust and mineral residue covered its surface. Rebecca directed her light upward. At first, Daniel saw only damaged wood. Then he noticed the outline of white paint. Michael moved closer and carefully cleared loose dirt from a small area without disturbing the timber itself. A vertical line appeared, then another shape. The number had almost disappeared, but enough remained to read it. For nearly a century, every surviving official map had insisted that Black Hollow ended with 13 numbered sections. Thomas Bell's notebook had insisted otherwise. Standing beneath the mountain in 2025, Daniel finally knew which record had told the truth. Section 14 existed, and the rails leading into it disappeared into darkness. Standing at the entrance to Section 14, Daniel Mercer felt that the investigation had crossed an important boundary. Until that moment, everything surrounding Black Hollow could still have been explained as incomplete history. Documents could be lost, maps could contain mistakes, and Thomas Bell could have misunderstood what he witnessed during the chaotic final weeks of the mine. But the number painted above the passage changed that. Section 14 was not a rumor or an interpretation. It physically existed inside the mountain, exactly where Bell's notebook and forgotten engineering diagram suggested it should be. More importantly, someone had removed it from the official record. Daniel photographed the faded number repeatedly, while Rebecca compared the junction with every version of the mine plan they had brought. The passage appeared on the early engineering diagram, disappeared from the February 1928 map, returned indirectly in Bell's notes during September, and vanished again from every plan associated with the closure. Whatever had happened there, the company had made a deliberate effort to separate this tunnel from the history of Black Hollow. The team did not immediately proceed. Michael Reeves examined the entrance and noticed that the supports inside Section 14 differed from those in the surrounding mine. The main junction contained older timber darkened by decades of moisture, but the first supports beyond the number 14 were noticeably more uniform. Metal brackets had been installed along several beams, and remnants of electrical cable remained attached to ceramic insulators. Sections of rail showed less corrosion beneath accumulated dirt, suggesting they had been laid later than the track outside. Thomas Bell's September 9th entry had specifically mentioned hundreds of feet of new rail being delivered east. Standing there 97 years later, the physical evidence seemed to confirm his observation. Black Hollow Mining Company had invested substantial labor and material in this passage only weeks before abandoning the entire operation. They moved forward slowly. Section 14 initially descended at a shallow angle before leveling out. The air felt cooler than in the main workings, and water ran along one side of the track. Every few yards, Daniel noticed marks left by the men who had reopened the passage in 1928. Newer supports had been positioned beside older ones rather than replacing them completely, creating an unusual mixture of construction periods. Some beams appear to belong to Black Hollow's earliest years, while others had been installed shortly before the closure. The deeper they traveled, the clearer it became that the company had not excavated Section 14 from the beginning in 1928. Workers had restored an older tunnel, just as Bell described. Approximately 200 yards from the junction, they encountered the remains of a wooden gate. One side had collapsed against the wall, but rusted hinges remained fixed to a support. A metal sign lay face down in the mud nearby. Rebecca carefully turned her light toward it while Daniel cleared enough debris to read the lettering. Most of the paint had disappeared, but 3 words remained visible. Authorized personnel only. There was no company logo and no explanation of what lay beyond. Michael pointed out that installing a physical gate underground required more effort than simply instructing workers to stay away. Management had expected unauthorized miners to become curious enough that verbal orders and guards alone might not be sufficient. Beyond the gate, evidence of hurried work increased. Coils of deteriorated electrical wire remained beside the wall. Broken wooden boxes were stacked near an alcove. Several empty metal containers bore manufacturing dates from the mid-1920s. Daniel found a damaged glove partly buried beneath debris, followed by the remains of a lamp. Nothing suggested that the area had been cleared when the mine closed. The workers appeared to have stopped almost exactly where they were working and never returned. Yet, unlike the main sections, where abandoned equipment could be explained by the sudden evacuation, Section 14 had supposedly remained accessible to supervisors for several days afterward. If management had wanted to recover important material from this tunnel, it had time to do so. The fact that so much remained suggested either that the equipment was not worth retrieving, or that the company wanted to spend as little time as possible beyond the restricted junction. The track continued for several hundred more feet before ending unexpectedly. 2 rails simply stopped beneath a layer of dirt and broken stone. Beyond them, the tunnel became narrower and rougher. Michael crouched beside the final section and examined the fastenings. The last rails had been installed quickly. Several spikes were uneven, and the supporting ties lacked the consistent spacing seen elsewhere. Bell's crew may have been extending the railway while engineers investigated the chamber. When Black Hollow closed, the work stopped before completion. Daniel checked the old diagram. According to the scale, they were approaching the region marked with a question mark. From that point forward, every step took them farther beyond what the official maps acknowledged. The tunnel walls also began changing. In the restored portion of Section 14, marks from mechanical drilling were obvious. Beyond the track, however, some surfaces appeared rougher and less regular. Michael stopped several times to inspect them. He believed part of the passage might predate the 1928 reopening and possibly even the founding of Black Hollow Mining Company. The evidence was not conclusive, but certain tool marks looked inconsistent with the machinery used during the company's later years. If earlier miners had excavated there, the tunnel could explain why the original Black Hollow engineers abandoned the eastern side. They may have encountered unknown workings and decided the area was not worth investigating. Then Rebecca noticed something carved into one wall. At first it appeared to be a random scratch. When they moved closer, several letters became visible beneath mineral deposits. The inscription was crude and partially damaged. Only a date could be read with confidence. Black Hollow Mining Company had not begun operations until 1906. Daniel stared at the numbers while Michael examined the surrounding surface. A carved date alone proved very little. Someone could have added it later, and there was no way to establish immediately when the marks were made. But combined with the unusual tunnel surfaces in 19th century property records Rebecca had discovered, the inscription strengthened the possibility that people had entered this part of the mountain before Black Hollow existed. The group photographed the marking and continued. A few yards farther, They found another indication of older activity, a narrow recess containing fragments of timber far more deteriorated than the supports installed by Black Hollow. Almost nothing remained except dark impressions and several corroded metal pieces. Whatever structure had once occupied the recess appeared to have been abandoned long before the 1928 crew returned. This created a new version of the story. Perhaps Black Hollow's engineers had not discovered a natural chamber at all. They may have broken into the remains of an earlier mine whose existence had been forgotten. That would explain the work surfaces and the 1891 inscription. It might even explain the question mark on the old engineering diagram. Early Black Hollow surveyors could have detected unknown workings but chosen not to pursue them. But it still did not explain the closure. Finding an old mine was unusual, not catastrophic. Even discovering that earlier prospectors had crossed property boundaries would hardly justify abandoning a profitable operation overnight. Something else must have happened after the 1928 crew entered the chamber. The passage narrowed until the group could no longer walk comfortably side by side. Their lights illuminated only short sections ahead, creating the impression that darkness itself was closing behind each turn. Daniel occasionally stopped and listened. There was no machinery, no voices, and no distant movement, only drops of water striking stone. For almost 97 years, this tunnel had existed without the footsteps of ordinary miners. The last people known to have traveled through it were the selected crew, engineers, and supervisors during Black Hollow's final days. About 40 minutes after passing the end of the rails, Michael raised his hand and stopped the group. Something was ahead. Their lights revealed a flat surface across the tunnel. At first, Daniel thought they had reached a natural collapse. Stones filled the passage from one side to the other, exactly as might be expected after decades underground. But Michael approached slowly and directed his light along the edges. The stones were too regular. He examined the lower section. There was mortar between them. Daniel felt the significance immediately. Natural rock falls did not contain mortar. The barrier extended from floor to ceiling and fitted tightly against both walls. Whoever built it had not merely piled stones into the passage. They had constructed a permanent wall. Much of the mortar had deteriorated, but the structure remained surprisingly intact. Mineral deposits ran across the surface, showing how long water had moved over it. Rebecca searched the surrounding area for markings. Near the center of the wall, partly hidden beneath pale deposits, she found a rectangular object embedded between stones. It was a metal plate roughly the size of a hand. Corrosion had obscured most of its surface. Daniel illuminated it while Michael gently removed loose dirt. Letters emerged first, then numbers. The plate read, "Sealed, October 1928. For several moments, nobody spoke. Thomas Bell had written that stone and cement were transported underground after the evacuation. Daniel had suspected materials might have been used to close Section 14. Now the evidence stood directly in front of them. The company had built this wall during the same month it abandoned Black Hollow. The official explanation for closing the mine had always been geological instability. If that explanation were complete, there would have been no obvious reason to construct a carefully mortared barrier deep inside an already condemned operation. The main entrance itself was eventually sealed. Building another wall half a mile underground required workers to transport heavy materials through passages the company publicly claimed were unsafe. Someone had wanted this particular tunnel closed before the rest of the mine. The group began examining the area around the barrier, without disturbing it. Along the right wall, several wooden boards lay beneath fallen debris. Near them was a rusted bucket containing hardened material that appeared consistent with old mortar. A damaged shovel rested nearby. The workers who built the barrier had apparently left some of their tools behind. Then Daniel's light caught the edge of something metallic beneath a collapsed timber several feet from the wall. It was not mining equipment. A small rectangular box had been pushed into a recess beside the passage and partly concealed by debris. Corrosion covered the surface, but the lid remained closed. Daniel initially wondered whether it contained tools used during construction. Rebecca noticed remnants of fabric or oilcloth trapped beneath the edge. The box was carefully examined in place before being opened. Inside were papers. Most had suffered severe damage from moisture. Some had fused into solid masses that could not be separated. Others remained partly protected by deteriorated wrapping. Daniel could see printed company headings on several pages. There were numbers, signatures, and handwritten notes. One document near the top was more legible than the rest. It contained a list, 23 names. Rebecca recognized several immediately from the payroll records she had studied. They belonged to workers assigned to Black Hollow during October 1928. The same men Daniel believed had formed the secret Eastern Crew. Beside many names were handwritten dates between late September and October 16th. At the bottom of the page was a short instruction. The writing had faded, but enough remained to read. East Crew, no surface disclosure. Thomas Bell had written about agreements. Now, deep inside Section 14, they had found a company document apparently ordering the workers involved in the Eastern operation not to discuss what they had seen. Daniel looked from the paper toward the wall. For almost a century, the company's story had required people to believe Black Hollow closed because of unstable rock. But unstable rock did not explain guards. It did not explain erase maps. It did not explain confidentiality agreements. And it certainly did not explain a deliberately constructed wall marked where the exact month the mine was abandoned. Whatever Black Hollow Mining Company had been trying to hide was no longer somewhere vaguely beneath the mountain. The team had reached its boundary. It was directly behind the wall in front of them. And for the first time since October 1928, people outside the company knew exactly where to look. The discovery of the wall changed the purpose of the investigation completely. Daniel Mercer had entered Black Hollow hoping to confirm that Section 14 existed, and that objective had already been achieved. The faded number above the junction, the newer rails, the restricted gate, the older passage, and finally the barrier marked October 1928 all supported Thomas Bell's account with remarkable consistency. In historical terms, they already had enough evidence to challenge the official version of Black Hollow's closure. But the wall created a question none of them could ignore. The company had evacuated more than 100 miners, prevented them from retrieving personal belongings, transported construction materials back underground, and built a permanent barrier at the end of a tunnel later erased from official maps. Then someone had left documents beside that barrier instructing the Eastern Crew not to disclose what they had seen. Whatever the company wanted to isolate was on the other side. The team did not attempt to force its way through immediately. Michael Reeves insisted that the barrier itself might be supporting loose material, and damaging it without understanding the surrounding structure could create a collapse. The group photographed every visible section, recorded measurements, and examined the walls and ceiling nearby. Daniel expected to find cracks indicating geological pressure, but the stone surrounding the barrier appeared no worse than many passages they had already crossed. That observation was significant. If Section 14 had been sealed because a specific location was dangerously unstable, there should have been some obvious evidence of deformation or collapse. Instead, the wall appeared to have been constructed across an intact tunnel. It was a door made from stone, not a repair made necessary by nature. They returned to the surface carrying photographs and careful notes, but the damaged documents remained protected where they had been found until they could determine how to handle them properly. Daniel spent the following weeks trying to reconstruct the 23 names visible on the list. Several match workers he had already identified through payroll records. Others required comparison with census documents and employment files. The pattern was clear. All 23 men were experienced underground workers, and most had been employed at Black Hollow for years. They were not random laborers hired shortly before the closure. Management had chosen people who understood mining and could be trusted with difficult work. Rebecca Shaw discovered another important detail. Several of those workers received unusually large final payments after Black Hollow closed. Ordinary miners were paid what the company owed them plus limited relocation assistance. Members of the Eastern Crew, however, appeared in surviving financial records with additional amounts equivalent to several months of wages. The payments were listed under vague descriptions, such as completion compensation and special termination allowance. There was no proof that the money purchased silence, but combined with Bell's reference to agreements and the document stating no surface disclosure, the implication was difficult to dismiss. Daniel attempted to trace descendants of the 23 men. Most families knew nothing about Section 14, but one conversation produced surprising memory. The grandson of a miner named Samuel Carter recalled a story his father had repeated when he was young. Samuel supposedly refused to discuss Black Hollow and became uncomfortable whenever anyone asked why the mine closed. Once, after drinking during a family gathering, he reportedly said that they should never have opened the old side. His family assumed he meant an unsafe section of the mine. Daniel now wondered whether Samuel had been talking about the chamber. Another descendant possessed a letter written in November 1928 by Eastern crew member William Hayes to his brother. Most of the letter concerned relocation and the difficulty of finding work, but one sentence stood out. "I cannot tell you what happened in the last workings, only that leaving was the right thing and I intend never to go back." Hayes did not explain why he could not tell his own brother what had happened. The wording suggested obligation rather than simple reluctance. Meanwhile, Michael studied the photographs of the barrier and developed a theory about its construction. The wall had likely been built quickly by a small crew using materials transported along Section 14's railway. The workmanship was competent, but not intended to withstand mining pressure. It was designed primarily to prevent passage. More interestingly, the wall did not appear to have been reinforced from the side facing the explorers. That suggested the builders completed it while withdrawing from the chamber side toward the main mine, sealing the opening behind them as they left. If so, nobody had been trapped beyond it intentionally. The barrier was the final act of an evacuation from whatever lay ahead. The question was whether there was another route into the chamber. The old diagram showed none. Surface surveys found no obvious shaft above the projected location. If the wall remained intact, the chamber may genuinely have been isolated from human access since 1928. Eventually, after further assessment of the site and the barrier, a limited opening became possible through an already deteriorated section near one edge. The goal was not to demolish the wall, but to create enough access to inspect the passage beyond while disturbing as little as possible. When the opening finally exposed darkness on the other side, Daniel experienced an unexpected hesitation. For months, the wall had represented the answer to Black Hollow. Now that the space beyond was accessible, he understood that the mystery might become less interesting rather than more. Perhaps there would be nothing beyond a barrier except another empty tunnel. Perhaps the company had overreacted to a structural problem, and elaborate secrecy had grown from ordinary corporate misconduct. History rarely provided discoveries as dramatic as imagination expected. Cold air moved through the opening. Daniel directed a light inside. The beam illuminated stone several feet beyond the wall, then disappeared around a slight bend. There was a passage. The group entered cautiously and immediately noticed that the tunnel beyond the barrier differed from Section 14. There were no rails. The floor was uneven, and several pieces of equipment had been abandoned along one side. A coil of electrical cable remained where it had been dropped. Wooden boxes sat against the wall. One had collapsed completely, spilling rusted metal components across the ground. The equipment appeared consistent with the late 1920s, confirming that Black Hollow workers had operated beyond the barrier before it was sealed. Approximately 40 feet ahead, the passage widened abruptly. Daniel entered first and stopped. The space beyond was much larger than he expected. Their lights moved slowly across an underground chamber, extending into darkness. The ceiling rose above the height of the surrounding tunnels, and the walls were irregular but clearly altered in places. Heavy timber supports had been installed by the 1928 crew along one side. Electrical cables crossed the floor towards several old lamp fixtures. A drilling machine stood near the center, its metal surfaces covered with corrosion. Nearby were wooden crates, sample containers, and tools. Everything had been left behind. It did not resemble a section that had been carefully closed after months of preparation. It looked like a workplace abandoned during an interrupted investigation. Michael immediately focused on the chamber walls. Some surfaces showed modern drilling marks from Black Hollow's crew. Others did not. Along the eastern side were cuts and grooves resembling those observed in the older portion of Section 14. If they were human-made, they predated the company's 1928 operation. Rebecca found additional fragments of extremely deteriorated timber embedded near one wall. Black Hollow had not created the entire chamber. Someone had worked there earlier. Daniel remembered the carved date in the passage. The possibility of a forgotten 19th century mine now seemed increasingly credible. But there was something else in the chamber that drew their attention. Against the far wall stood a wooden table. Unlike most timber underground, it remained recognizable because the chamber was relatively dry. Several objects rested on top: metal containers, damaged notebooks, a measuring instrument, and a cylindrical case. Papers lay scattered beneath the table, some reduced to fragments. One chair had fallen backward beside it. Daniel approached slowly. The cylinder was metal and sealed with a corroded cap. Inside was a tightly rolled sheet of paper protected far better than the documents found outside the wall. When the sheet was eventually examined, it proved to be an engineering survey dated October 11, 1928, only 6 days before the evacuation. The drawing showed Section 14. It showed the passage, and it showed the chamber. For the first time, Daniel was looking at a detailed company map of the area that had disappeared from every surviving official plan. Measurements covered the page. Several smaller passages extended from the chamber. Property boundaries were marked above the underground layout. One line showed Section 14 crossing beneath land Black Hollow Mining Company did not own. Rebecca immediately recognized the neighboring tract. That alone represented serious evidence of unauthorized excavation. But another notation was even more important. Near the chamber, an engineer had written, "Existing workings encountered. Origin undetermined." The wording confirmed what Michael suspected. Black Hollow workers had not excavated the chamber from solid rock. They had encountered an underground space that already existed. Another line was drawn beyond the eastern wall, accompanied by measurements and the abbreviation OLD. Nobody initially understood what it meant. Michael compared it with the physical chamber and realized the surveyor was distinguishing Black Hollow's new excavation from earlier workings. The company had discovered an older network beneath the mountain. Daniel turned his attention to the notebooks on the table. Most were too damaged to examine immediately, but one remained partly protected inside a leather cover. Several pages are fused together, while others could still be separated. A name was written inside the front: Harold J. Whitmore, the chief engineer. Daniel had spent months searching archives for Whitmore's missing records. They had never been sent to an archive. They had been sealed inside the mountain. The first readable pages contained measurements and ordinary engineering observations. Whitmore described the reopening of the Eastern Passage, reinforcement work, and discovery of older timber. Then the entries became increasingly concerned with structural conditions. He repeatedly mentioned support pillars, boundary measurements, and excavation carried out during previous years. One entry was dated October 10th. Survey confirms east extraction beyond authorized line. Harlan informed. The next day, Whitmore wrote that several support pillars shown on an earlier plan were no longer present. Michael immediately understood the significance. In underground mining, pillars of untouched rock can be intentionally left in place to help support surrounding material. Removing them to extract additional or can increase profit, but it could also weaken a large area. If Black Hollow workers had removed important support structures without proper engineering approval, management might have created exactly the geological danger later blamed on nature. Daniel continued reading. On October 13th, Whitmore recorded new measurements and expressed concern that movement in the eastern workings was greater than expected. On October 14th, he recommended suspending activity. On October 15th, he wrote that Superintendent Harlan had received instructions from company directors to continue limited investigation. Then came October 16th, the day Thomas Bell wrote that the chamber had been found. Whitmore's entry was longer than the others. The 1928 crew had opened additional sections of the older workings and discovered that unauthorized Black Hollow excavation had intersected them from another direction. The company had apparently been extracting valuable material beyond its legal boundary for years, either knowingly or through records that had been deliberately altered. Worse, some of that extraction had weakened rock structures separating newer tunnels from the older network. Whitmore believed the eastern side was becoming unstable, but his final sentence changed the meaning of everything. The danger has been known longer than I was told. Daniel read it again. Whitmore was not describing a sudden discovery. Someone within Black Hollow Mining Company had known about the structural problem before October 1928. The mine had continued operating anyway. The next page was dated October 17th. The handwriting was less controlled than usual. Whitmore wrote that movement had been detected that morning and that he had ordered immediate evacuation of the eastern sections. Shortly afterward, management expanded the evacuation to the entire mine. He recommended notifying inspectors and providing complete engineering records. Beneath that recommendation, he added another sentence. Directors refused disclosure. There it was. Not speculation. Not a family story. Not a rumor passed down by miners. A statement written by Black Hollow's own chief engineer on the day the mine closed. The company had discovered dangerous conditions partly connected to unauthorized excavation. Its chief engineer wanted the authorities informed. The directors refused. Daniel looked around the chamber. The equipment, the maps, and Whitmore's notebook had all been left behind when the company sealed Section 14. Perhaps management believed destroying the documents would create additional risk if anyone noticed. Perhaps the closure happened too quickly to remove everything. Or perhaps Whitmore intentionally left his notebook where someone might eventually find it. Whatever the reason, the mountain had preserved a record, but the notebook was not finished. Several readable pages remained, and as Daniel continued through Whitmore's final entries, he realized the company had faced a problem even larger than illegal mining. The structural danger beneath Black Hollow did not end at the mine boundary. According to Whitmore's calculations, the weakened underground zone extended toward the valley, toward the settlement itself. For several minutes after reading Whitmore's final calculation, Daniel Mercer said nothing. Until that point, the evidence inside the chamber had suggested a story of corporate misconduct that was serious but understandable. Black Hollow Mining Company had expanded beyond its legal boundaries, concealed unauthorized excavation, and ignored warnings about structural weakness because valuable or remained underground. Those actions could explain the secrecy surrounding Section 14 and the decision to remove it from later maps. But the possibility that instability extended toward the settlement changed the scale of what management had hidden. Black Hollow had not been simply a workplace. Hundreds of people lived above and around the underground network. Families slept in company houses. Children attended school. Trains crossed the valley. And workers gathered every morning within a landscape that might have been affected by decisions made deep beneath their feet. If Whitmore's calculations were correct, the directors were not merely protecting the company from financial losses. They were trying to avoid responsibility for a danger that could eventually threaten the community the company itself had built. Michael Reeves studied the engineering survey, while Daniel continued examining Whitmore's notebook. The document was difficult to interpret because the mine existed on multiple underground levels, and the lines drawn on the paper represented passages at different depths. Michael began reconstructing the geometry, using the measurements written beside each tunnel. Black Hollow's official workings generally followed the strongest mineral deposits, while leaving large masses of untouched rock between sections. Those areas helped distribute pressure and provided natural separation between excavated zones. The eastern workings were different. During several years of aggressive expansion, miners had apparently followed a valuable deposit toward the property boundary and then continued beyond it. To maximize extraction, crews removed material from areas that earlier engineers had intended to leave untouched. Some of those changes were missing from official maps. The result was an underground region far larger and more interconnected than regulators or ordinary workers would have understood from company records. The forgotten 19th century workings made the situation worse. Whoever excavated the eastern chamber before Black Hollow arrived had removed additional rock without leaving reliable plans. Black Hollow's later tunnels approached those older cavities from several directions. In some places, only relatively thin barriers remained between them. When the company reopened the old Eastern Passage in 1928, engineers finally gained access to enough of the hidden network to understand how much material had disappeared. The mountain beneath the eastern side was not solid in the way management had assumed. It contained overlapping excavations from different periods, some undocumented, and some intentionally omitted from official plans. Whitmore's entry suggested that he had been unaware of the full extent until October 1928. He repeatedly expressed frustration that older surveys did not match physical conditions. One passage shown as solid rock on a company plan turned out to contain an abandoned extraction cavity. Another support pillar marked on a 1923 diagram was significantly smaller than recorded. In several places, measurements suggested miners had removed material after engineers completed their official surveys. Whitmore began to suspect that production supervisors had quietly encouraged crews to extract ore from restricted areas to increase output. If true, Black Hollow's celebrated production records had been achieved partly by consuming the very structures intended to keep portions of the mine stable. Daniel found an entry dated October 12th in which Whitmore described confronting Superintendent Charles Harlan about missing supports. According to the notebook, Harlan initially blamed outdated mapping. Whitmore rejected that explanation because some alterations were too recent. He had inspected several areas himself only years earlier. Someone had authorized additional extraction without updating the engineering plans. Whitmore demanded production records from the previous 5 years. Harlan refused to provide them immediately and insisted that the Eastern investigation continue until company directors arrived. That disagreement explained the argument Thomas Bell had overheard near the entrance. Whitmore had wanted to stop. Harlan had orders to continue. The company was still trying to determine how valuable the eastern deposits might be, even while its chief engineer questioned whether the area was safe. Then Whitmore discovered something that apparently ended the debate. During measurements taken inside the chamber on October 16th, his team found fractures extending through a major rock structure separating the eastern workings from older passages. Small fractures were not unusual underground, but their orientation suggested pressure was being redistributed through areas that had lost support. Whitmore compared the new measurements with notes from earlier inspections and realized some cracks had widened. The movement was slow, perhaps almost imperceptible, but it demonstrated that the underground structure was changing. He ordered work suspended. That evening, Whitmore prepared a preliminary report for company directors. Daniel found fragments of what appeared to be that report among the papers beneath the table. Most pages were damaged, but several conclusions remained readable. The eastern workings required immediate closure. No further extraction should occur until a complete structural survey was completed. Unauthorized passages needed to be reported. Surface monitoring should begin around the settlement. Most importantly, Whitmore recommended evacuating workers from affected underground areas until engineers could determine whether movement was continuing. The directors arrived at Black Hollow that night. The meeting Thomas Bell observed from outside the administrative building was therefore not simply a discussion about a mysterious chamber. Senior management had traveled to the valley because their chief engineer was warning that years of undocumented extraction had created a potentially serious structural problem. The following morning came the vibration. Michael believed the event described by workers on October 17th was probably a localized underground movement rather than a major collapse. It may have involved only a small section of rock shifting somewhere within the eastern network. But to Whitmore, it confirmed that his concerns were no longer theoretical. Something inside the mountain was moving. He ordered evacuation. The decision likely prevented the situation from becoming worse. More than 100 miners reached the surface without injury. Had management stopped there, Black Hollow might have become a story about a company discovering dangerous practices and responding responsibly. Instead, according to Whitmore's notebook, the directors immediately began discussing how much information could be concealed. One entry described a meeting held during the afternoon of October 17th. Whitmore wrote that he again demanded notification of mining authorities. The directors argued that no catastrophic collapse had occurred, and therefore immediate disclosure was unnecessary. They wanted additional time to evaluate the company's legal exposure. Whitmore warned that any investigation would reveal unauthorized extraction and falsified plans. One director allegedly responded that this was precisely why inspectors could not be allowed underground. The official explanation was created that same day. Geological movement. The phrase was technically true. Movement had occurred. What the statement omitted was why the mine had become unstable and how long company management might have known about the risk. Daniel continued to the notebook until he found a folded sheet inserted between 2 pages. It contained a rough surface map of Black Hollow. Houses were represented by small rectangles, while the school, clinic, and administrative building were labeled. Beneath the surface features, Whitmore had drawn projected underground lines from the eastern workings. One line extended beneath the edge of the settlement. Michael examined the page carefully. He cautioned that the drawing did not prove the entire town was in immediate danger. Underground instability could remain localized for decades or stabilize naturally. Whitmore himself appeared uncertain. His notes used phrases such as possible influence zone and requires monitoring, but that uncertainty may have frightened company directors even more. If they admitted the mine had been weakened through unauthorized excavation, they could become responsible not only for closing the operation, but potentially for relocating families and monitoring the valley for years. Instead, the company solved both problems simultaneously. It closed Black Hollow. By declaring the mine permanently unsafe for natural geological reasons, management could remove workers without admitting misconduct. By giving families limited time to leave company housing, it could gradually empty the settlement without announcing that the ground beneath portions of it might require observation. Once the community disappeared, the company's long-term exposure would shrink dramatically. No miners underground, no families living above questionable workings, no inspectors examining Section 14, and no witnesses asking why the maps were wrong. Rebecca began comparing the closure timeline with housing records. What she found supported the theory. Families were initially told they had several months to relocate, but company representatives offered additional payments to those who left earlier. Houses were not sold to former workers, even when some expressed interest. Instead, Black Hollow Mining Company retained ownership of most residential property, while the buildings became empty. This was unusual. A company dissolving its operation might have sold houses, land, and commercial structures to recover money. Black Hollow seemed more interested in removing residents than recovering value from the settlement. The school closed almost immediately. The clinic closed. The general store stopped extending credit. Railway service was reduced and then discontinued. Within months, the valley had been emptied far more completely than economic necessity alone required. One family remained longer than most. Records showed that an elderly former employee named Henry Lawson continued living near the western edge of the settlement into 1930. According to a newspaper notice Daniel found later, Lawson eventually accepted payment from a company representative to vacate the property. The amount was surprisingly generous for an abandoned house. The company then demolished several remaining structures rather than selling them. Black Hollow was not merely dying. It was being cleared. That realization gave new meaning to the disappearance of the settlement from later maps. Daniel had assumed Black Hollow faded because there was no economic reason for anyone to remain. Now it appeared the company had actively accelerated the process. But one question still bothered him. If management feared instability beneath the settlement, why seal the documents inside the chamber rather than destroy them? Whitmore's notebook provided a possible answer. His entries after October 17th became increasingly hostile toward the directors. He described arguments about falsifying the final engineering report and removing Section 14 from maps. On October 18th, he wrote that he refused to sign a document stating that the eastern instability resulted entirely from natural conditions. The following day, he recorded that Harlan had taken control of company records and restricted his access to the administrative office. Whitmore was losing authority. Then came an entry dated October 21st. They intend to close East Workings and remove all reference. I have retained original survey. Daniel looked toward the metal cylinder on the table. The original survey. Whitmore had kept it. The next entry was shorter. Copies unsafe above. That sentence suggested the documents inside the chamber might not have been forgotten accidentally. Whitmore may have hidden them there deliberately before Section 14 was sealed. Perhaps he understood that company officials would destroy anything remaining in the administrative building. Perhaps he believed someone would eventually return. The final pages became difficult to read because of damage, but one entry remained almost completely intact. It was dated October 24th, a week after the evacuation. Whitmore wrote that the Eastern crew had begun preparing the passage for closure. He knew the chamber would soon become inaccessible. He described placing engineering notes, surveys, and selected records together. Then he wrote, "If this is open again, the maps will show what was done." Daniel read the sentence twice. For 97 years, people had assumed Black Hollow Mining Company sealed Section 14 to hide evidence. That remained true. But someone inside the company had apparently used the same wall for the opposite purpose. Harold Whitmore had hidden evidence behind it, so the truth would survive. The barrier had protected the company's secret, and at the same time, it had protected the proof. There was one final entry. October 25th, 1928. Whitmore described leaving the chamber after placing the documents on the wooden table. The Eastern crew will begin sealing the passage the following morning. He expected never to return. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting darker than the lines above it, he wrote, "They will call it the mountain's fault." For nearly a century, that was exactly what everyone called it. The documents preserved inside the chamber explained why Black Hollow Mining Company wanted Section 14 erased, but they created another mystery that Daniel Mercer could not ignore. 23 miners had worked in the eastern section during the final weeks of the operation. Those men had entered the old passage, helped reopen forgotten workings, witnessed the discovery of the chamber, and, in several cases, participated in the final effort to seal it. Unlike Harold Whitmore, they were ordinary employees with families, friends, and connections throughout the settlement. If even a handful of them had openly described what happened underground, the official explanation for Black Hollow's closure might have collapsed within weeks. Yet no newspaper had ever published their story. No government investigation appeared to have been triggered by their testimony. No detailed account had survived in local history. For almost 97 years, the men who knew the most remained almost completely silent. Rebecca Shaw returned to the payroll records and began reconstructing the final payments made after October 17th. Most Black Hollow employees received predictable amounts. Wages owed for completed shifts, limited severance, and in some cases small relocation allowances. The 23 names found on the document beside the wall were different. 17 received substantial additional payments within 2 weeks of the closure. For more appeared in records connected with special company disbursements whose purpose was not clearly identified. 2 could not be traced because parts of the financial ledger were missing. The amounts varied, but several men received the equivalent of months of ordinary wages at a time when losing employment could place an entire family in immediate financial difficulty. Money alone did not prove a conspiracy. Black Hollow could have compensated the Eastern crew because they performed specialized work or because management required them to remain after other miners were dismissed. But another document inside Whitmore's collection provided stronger evidence. It was a partially preserved memorandum dated October 22nd and addressed to Superintendent Harlan. The surviving text referred to individual acknowledgments required from personnel assigned to the Eastern workings. Another line instructed that additional compensation should be issued only after those acknowledgments were completed. The exact language of the agreements had not survived, but the meaning was difficult to misunderstand. The company was paying selected workers, after requiring them to sign, something related specifically to Section 14. Daniel began searching for the families of those men again, this time asking more precise questions. Instead of mentioning a mysterious chamber, he asked whether their relatives had ever spoken about receiving money when Black Hollow closed or being forbidden to discuss part of the mine. The responses were inconsistent, as memories passed through generations often are, but several contained similar details. One family remembered that their grandfather returned home after the closure, carrying an envelope of cash, and told his wife they had enough money to leave immediately. Another remembered being told that a relative had signed company papers before moving west. A third described a miner who refused throughout his life to discuss the eastern side of Black Hollow. The most detailed account came from descendants of Samuel Carter, whose name appeared near the top of the list. Carter had been 37 years old in 1928 and had worked at Black Hollow for more than a decade. He moved his family hundreds of miles away shortly after the mine closed and never returned to the valley. His grandson possessed several family letters, including one written by Carter's wife, Eleanor, to her sister in November 1928. Eleanor described the closure as frightening, but wrote that Samuel had received enough money from the company to support the family temporarily. Then she added a strange sentence. He says, I must not ask him what happened in the last tunnel, because talking will only bring trouble. Daniel read the line repeatedly. It was not proof that Carter had been threatened, but it showed that secrecy had reached workers' homes. Samuel had not simply chosen to avoid discussing a traumatic workplace closure. He had specifically warned his wife against asking about the last tunnel. Another letter contained an even more revealing detail. William Hayes, another member of the Eastern crew, wrote to his brother that he had been offered work through a company contact in another state. Daniel investigated and discovered that several Section 14 miners obtained employment unusually quickly after Black Hollow closed, sometimes at operations connected through investors or executives associated with the former company. The arrangement may have been another form of compensation. Management could not guarantee silence forever, but providing displaced workers with money and new jobs gave them powerful reasons not to create problems. There was also fear. Mining communities depended heavily on reputation. A worker publicly accusing a former employer of illegal practices risked being labeled difficult or unreliable. During an era when jobs were often obtained through personal recommendations, challenging powerful company executives could destroy a man's ability to support his family. The 23 miners did not need to be physically threatened to understand what was expected. A signed agreement, several months of wages and assistance, finding another job might have been enough. But not everyone accepted the arrangement quietly. Among the damaged documents in the chamber, Rebecca found a handwritten note referring to a worker named Edward Mallory. Mallory's name appeared on the Section 14 list, but unlike most others, no additional payment could be found in surviving records. A short memorandum stated that Mallory had declined acknowledgement and should not be permitted access to company property. Daniel searched newspapers for the name. 3 weeks after Black Hollow closed, a small article appeared in a regional paper. Edward Mallory had been arrested following an argument outside a railway station. The article described him as an unemployed miner recently displaced from Black Hollow. According to the report, Mallory had been intoxicated and accused former supervisors of burying the truth under the mountain. The newspaper treated the statement as the angry words of a man who had lost his job. There was no follow-up article. Daniel could hardly believe the phrase, burying the truth under the mountain. In 1928, nobody reading those words would have known about Section 14 or the wall. Nearly a century later, the meaning seemed painfully literal. Mallory disappeared from local records shortly afterward. For several weeks, Daniel feared something sinister had happened to him. Further research produced a less dramatic answer. Mallory moved to another state and worked intermittently in construction before dying many years later. There was no evidence the company harmed him, but there was also no evidence he ever publicly discussed Black Hollow again. The pattern became clearer. Silence had not required a single dramatic conspiracy involving every worker. It had been created through ordinary pressures: money, employment, legal agreements, uncertainty, and the passage of time. Some men probably understood only part of what had happened. The Eastern crew knew they had discovered older workings and that the company suddenly closed the mine, but most may never have seen Whitmore's calculations or learned about falsified maps. Without documents, any accusation they made could be dismissed as rumor. Management controlled the official records and the public explanation. Thomas Bell occupied an unusual position. He had not been part of 23, so he was never asked to sign the same agreement. He knew Section 14 existed because his maintenance work brought him near the junction. He knew about the chamber because another miner told him. He saw construction materials going underground after the evacuation. But Bell did not know the engineering details preserved in Whitmore's notebook. He had enough information to distrust the company, but not enough to prove anything. That was why his final sentence was so important. The mountain didn't close the mine. They did. Bell had understood the essential truth even without knowing the mechanism. The company spent the final weeks of 1928 dismantling not only an operation, but a community capable of remembering what happened. Workers scattered across the country. Houses emptied. Company records disappeared. The railway stopped bringing outsiders into the valley. Within a few years, Black Hollow was no longer a functioning settlement where dozens of witnesses could compare memories. It became a story individuals carried privately into separate lives. Daniel began mapping where the 23 Eastern workers went after closure. The result was striking. Within 5 years, almost none remained near Black Hollow. Families moved in every direction, following jobs through mining regions, industrial cities, and agricultural communities. Several crossed state lines multiple times during the economic turmoil of the following decade. Children grew up hearing only fragments about the place their parents had left. By the time historians became interested in abandoned mining settlements, the witnesses were elderly or dead. Black Hollow's secret survived not because hundreds of people participated in a perfect conspiracy. It survived because the people who knew pieces of the truth were separated before those pieces could be assembled. One man knew about the guards. Another knew about the chamber. Another knew about the unusual payments. Whitmore knew about the engineering danger. Bell knew the maps were wrong. Mallory knew something had been deliberately buried. But nobody outside management had everything. Until the chamber was opened, the documents on Whitmore's table brought those fragments together for the first time. Daniel and Rebecca could compare engineering notes with payroll records, property deeds with family letters, Bell's observations with the physical tunnel. Details that had seemed meaningless in isolation now formed a coherent sequence. The company had crossed its legal boundary. Workers had removed material from areas that should have remained intact. Older undocumented workings made the eastern side more fragile than expected. Whitmore discovered the extent of the problem. Management refused disclosure. The mine was evacuated. Selected workers were paid and required to sign agreements. Section 14 was sealed. Maps were altered. Families were moved away. Then the company disappeared. There was no single document saying, "This is our plan to hide everything." There did not need to be. The actions themselves told the story. Yet one question remained unanswered. How much danger had actually existed beneath the settlement? Black Hollow had stood abandoned for nearly a century without any famous disaster. No enormous crater swallowed the valley. The mountain remained standing. Trees covered the old houses, and the landscape appeared peaceful. Perhaps the directors had panicked unnecessarily. Perhaps Whitmore's worst predictions never came true. Michael wanted to answer that question because it determined how the company's actions should be understood. If management believed the catastrophic collapse was imminent, evacuating the settlement might have protected lives even if the secrecy was unethical. If the danger was limited, the closure could have been primarily an attempt to avoid legal exposure. The engineering documents provided estimates, but not certainty. Then Daniel noticed several entries in Whitmore's notebook referring to monitoring points on the surface. Small markers had apparently been installed around Black Hollow during October 1928 to measure ground movement. If any survived, their locations could reveal exactly which part of the settlement engineers feared was affected. One marker was shown near the school, another near the railway platform. A third was positioned behind a row of company houses, and the final marker was placed on the hillside east of the settlement, almost directly above the old underground chamber. Daniel compared the locations with modern maps. The school was gone. The houses were gone. The railway platform was gone. But the eastern hillside had barely been disturbed since 1928. Several days later, the group climbed through dense vegetation toward the approximate position shown in Whitmore's notes. They searched for hours without success. Near sunset, Rebecca noticed a small piece of metal emerging from a moss-covered stone. They cleared the vegetation around it. Embedded in the rock was a corroded survey marker. A number was stamped into its surface. E4. Daniel recognized it immediately from Whitmore's notebook. Beside the designation, the engineer had recorded measurements taken during the final days of Black Hollow. October 16th, October 17th, October 18th. The position had shifted slightly each time. Then the measurements stopped. Not because the movement stopped, because the company stopped measuring. And beneath that hillside, according to the hidden map, one of Black Hollow's largest undocumented cavities extended toward the abandoned settlement. The discovery of survey marker E forgave Michael Reeves something the historical documents alone could not provide, a fixed point connecting Harold Whitmore's underground calculations with the modern landscape. Until then, the team had been reconstructing Black Hollow largely through maps created almost a century earlier many of them incomplete or deliberately altered. Now they could identify the precise surface location from which Whitmore had measured movement during the final days of the mine. The marker itself did not reveal whether the ground was still moving, but its existence confirmed that engineers had been monitoring the hillside before Black Hollow closed. That detail had never appeared in the company's public explanation. Management had told workers that geological movement was discovered suddenly on October 17th. Whitmore's notebook showed something different. Measurements had already begun before the evacuation, meaning engineers suspected a structural problem, while more than 100 men continued working underground, and families remained in the settlement above. Michael used the marker as a reference to align the hidden engineering survey with modern topographical data. The result changed their understanding of Black Hollow. The mine was not simply a collection of narrow tunnels beneath a mountain. In the eastern area, decades of extraction had created large connected spaces at several levels. Some belonged to Black Hollow Mining Company, others appear to predate it, and several had been expanded beyond legal property boundaries. When Michael layered the plans together, he identified a broad underground zone where natural rock had been removed from multiple directions. At its center lay the chamber discovered behind the seal wall. From there, older passages extended eastward, while Black Hollow's undocumented excavations approached from the west and below. The mountain had effectively been hollowed out in ways no single official map acknowledged. The most troubling feature was a long, unsupported area identified in Whitmore's notes as the East Crown. According to early engineering plans, a substantial body of rock had been intentionally preserved there. It separated upper workings from deeper extraction cavities and helped distribute pressure through the surrounding formation. Later surveys showed portions of that material missing. Whitmore apparently discovered in October 1928 that production crews had been removing valuable ore from the East Crown gradually, possibly for years. Because the changes were not properly recorded, engineers evaluating the mine believed more support remained than actually existed. Daniel Mercer searched production records for evidence of when the unauthorized extraction began. Black Hollow's output increased sharply between 1924 and 1927 despite company reports suggesting that easily accessible deposits were becoming less productive. Investors praised management for improving efficiency. Bonuses were paid to senior supervisors after record years. One internal memorandum recovered from the chamber contained a phrase Daniel found particularly revealing: "Eastern recovery continues above projection." The document did not specify where the material came from, but the timing corresponded with Whitmore's suspicion that extraction had occurred outside approved plans. The motive was ordinary: money. There had been no mysterious object powerful enough to frighten the company away, no impossible discovery, and no supernatural force beneath the mountain. The secret was more human and, in some ways, more disturbing. Black Hollow had been consuming its own structural safety to maintain production. Every additional load of valuable material removed from restricted areas improved short-term profits while increasing uncertainty underground. The company celebrated record output at the surface while the margin protecting its workers grew thinner beneath their feet. Whitmore may not have understood the full situation because official engineering maps were being updated from reports supplied by production supervisors. If those reports omitted unauthorized excavation, even the chief engineer could underestimate how much rock had been removed. The reopening of the old Eastern Passage in 1928 exposed the discrepancy. When the crew broke into the forgotten chamber and surveyed the surrounding workings, Whitmore could finally measure the mountain from the opposite side. Passages that should have been separated were much closer together than expected. Pillars shown on official plans were smaller or missing. The old 19th century excavation increased the size of the unsupported zone. For the first time, Whitmore could see what Black Hollow had become. The chamber was not the secret. It was a place from which the secret became visible. That distinction explained Thomas Bell's final weeks perfectly. The company reopened Section 14 because executives believed the old Eastern anomaly might lead to additional valuable deposits. Guards protected the exploration because management wanted the discovery kept confidential. The selected crew entered the forgotten workings, and engineers began surveying. Instead of finding an opportunity to extend Black Hollow's future, They found evidence of what previous extraction had already done. The mine had effectively investigated itself, and the result was dangerous enough that Whitmore wanted operations stopped. Michael returned to the measurements recorded at E4. The numbers represented extremely small changes, but the pattern mattered more than their size. Whitmore had measured the marker repeatedly over several days and recorded movement in a consistent direction. Another marker near the settlement showed a smaller change. A third remained nearly stable. This suggested the eastern hillside was responding more strongly than the central valley. It did not mean the entire settlement was about to collapse, but it supported Whitmore's fear that underground pressure was being redistributed. Then Michael noticed something Daniel had overlooked. Whitmore had written a small notation beside the October 17th measurement. After event, the event was almost certainly the vibration miners felt that morning. If so, Whitmore had returned to the surface marker after the underground movement and confirmed that its position had changed. That would explain why his recommendation became urgent. He no longer had only theoretical calculations. He had physical evidence linking underground movement with measurable change at the surface. The directors now faced a devastating situation. If they reported the problem honestly, investigators would ask for historical plans. Those plans would be compared with the actual mine. Unauthorized extraction would become obvious. Neighboring landowners could claim theft of mineral resources. Workers could argue they've been exposed to risks concealed by management. Families might need to be relocated while engineers assess the settlement. Investors could lose everything. Senior executives could face personal consequences. If the company remained silent and continued mining, however, another movement could injure or kill workers. So management chose the option that protected both lives and itself. It evacuated Black Hollow, but lied about why. That distinction complicated Daniel's view of the people responsible. The directors had acted dishonestly, but they had not forced workers back underground after Whitmore's warning. Once the danger became undeniable, they removed everyone. The evacuation itself may have prevented a tragedy. Their wrongdoing lay in the years before it and in the cover-up afterward. They had apparently benefited from unauthorized extraction, ignored warning signs, and then blamed nature when the consequences arrived. Black Hollow's official statement was therefore carefully constructed. It said geological movement made continued operation unsafe. Technically, that was true. It did not say the movement was unexpected. It did not say the company had no responsibility. And it did not mention Section 14. The truth had been hidden inside the spaces between those statements. Rebecca found another document in Whitmore's papers that demonstrated how deliberately management controlled the story. It was a draft public announcement with several handwritten corrections. An earlier version referred to structural complications in eastern workings. Someone crossed out the phrase and replaced it with geological conditions. Another sentence originally mentioned an engineering review. That was removed entirely. The final statement gave readers no reason to suspect company activity had contributed to the closure. Then came the settlement. If Black Hollow had simply been an unsafe mine, workers could leave while families remained in their homes temporarily. Some might have found employment elsewhere and continued living in the valley. Instead, company housing was emptied quickly and residents were encouraged financially to relocate. The reason now seemed clear. Management did not know whether the underground instability could eventually affect the surface. The safest legal strategy was also the safest physical strategy. Remove everyone, then remove the evidence. By early 1929, Black Hollow was nearly deserted. Without maintenance, drainage systems failed. Rain entered abandoned buildings. Vegetation spread across yards. The railway carried fewer trains until service ended completely. Structures were dismantled for reusable materials, while others simply collapsed. The company retained ownership of much of the land, preventing another community from immediately replacing the one that had disappeared. The mountain remained quiet. Years passed, then decades. The catastrophic event Whitmore feared never arrived, at least not in the form anyone would have recognized. Daniel searched historical aerial photographs and geological records for evidence of surface changes after 1928. In an image taken decades later, Michael noticed a shallow depression on the eastern hillside. It was subtle enough to appear natural. When compared with the hidden underground map, however, the depression sat almost directly above the undocumented workings. The team visited the location. Trees had grown across it, making the shape difficult to recognize from ground level. Michael estimated that part of the hillside had settled gradually rather than collapsing suddenly. If that interpretation was correct, Whitmore's concerns had been justified. The weakened underground zone had changed after the mine closed, but because the settlement was empty and the area largely forgotten, nobody noticed. Black Hollow had avoided disaster partly because Black Hollow no longer existed. The company had removed the people before the mountain could prove how serious the problem was. Daniel stood on the hillside, looking toward the forest covering the former settlement. Somewhere beneath the trees were foundations of houses whose occupants had been told only that their jobs were gone. Those families never knew that engineers had been placing survey markers around their homes. They never knew that management was calculating underground influence zones while encouraging them to relocate. They believed Black Hollow disappeared because the mine closed. The document suggested the opposite was also true. The town was empty because the mine beneath it could no longer be trusted. There was still one unexplored part of the story. On Whitmore's hidden survey, beyond the chamber and older eastern workings, a narrow passage continued to a symbol Daniel had noticed from the beginning. The line ended at a rectangular mark with no description, only a question mark. During their first examination of the chamber, collapsed timber and debris had prevented the team from investigating that area closely. Michael had assumed it represented another abandoned branch of the 19th century workings. But after reviewing Whitmore's notebook again, Daniel found a reference dated October 12th. Further opening postponed by order directors. The wording was strange. Not excavation. Opening. Something at the far end of the old workings had apparently been closed even before Black Hollow arrived. The 1928 engineers had considered opening it. Management stopped them. Daniel compared the notation with the chamber survey. The mysterious rectangle was approximately 60 feet beyond the eastern wall. The group returned underground and carefully examined the area behind the collapsed timber. Beyond it, they found a narrow passage. Unlike Section 14, there were no modern rails or electrical fixtures. The walls carried the same older tool marks found elsewhere. They followed it until their lights reached something flat. Metal. A heavily corroded steel door stood across the end of the passage, partly embedded in surrounding rock. There was no Black Hollow company name on it. No date. No explanation. Only a locking mechanism so old and deteriorated that its original design was difficult to identify. Daniel checked Whitmore's survey. The door was exactly where the question mark appeared. Black Hollow Mining Company had discovered it in 1928, but according to Whitmore's notebook, they had never opened it. For safety reasons, Daniel's team would not open it either. The rock around the passage had deteriorated significantly, and disturbing the structure without stabilization would create unnecessary risk. Whatever existed beyond the door would have to remain unknown, and perhaps that was appropriate. Because after months of investigation, the greatest mystery of Black Hollow had already been solved. The secret hidden for nearly a century was not treasure behind forgotten door. It was a decision. A company had removed too much from beneath a mountain, discovered what it had done, evacuated an entire community, changed the maps and sealed the evidence underground. Then it allowed time to erase everything else. Almost everything. Harold Whitmore had made sure the mountain kept one copy of the truth. The steel door at the end of the forgotten passage was the kind of discovery that could easily transform a historical investigation into speculation. Daniel Mercer understood that immediately. For months, every important conclusion about Black Hollow had been supported by something tangible. Thomas Bell's notebook, company payroll records, altered maps, Section 14 itself, the stone barrier dated October 1928, Harold Whitmore's engineering notes, and the surface markers positioned around the abandoned settlement. The door was different. There were no surviving records explaining who installed it, what existed behind it, or even when it had been placed there. Whitmore's survey showed only a rectangular symbol accompanied by a question mark, while his notebook contained a brief statement that further opening had been postponed by order of the directors. That was enough to prove the 1928 engineers knew about the obstruction. It was not enough to justify inventing an answer for what lay beyond. Michael Reeves examined the surrounding passage carefully and quickly concluded that opening the door would be irresponsible. The rock above it contained several fractures, and sections of the old excavation showed signs of long-term deterioration. The steel itself had become heavily corroded. Whatever locking mechanism once existed was partly fused by rust and mineral deposits. More importantly, nobody knew what structural role the sealed opening might now play. Disturbing it could release loose material or destabilize a section that had remained untouched for generations. The purpose of their investigation had never been to conquer every inaccessible part of the mine. They had entered Black Hollow to understand why it closed. They already possessed that answer. Still, Daniel wanted to understand the door historically. Rebecca Shaw returned to 19th century property records, searching for references to earlier mining activity beneath the eastern ridge. The evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. Several prospectors had registered claims in the surrounding area during the late 1880s and early 1890s, but records from small operations were often vague. One partnership appeared particularly interesting. In 1890, 3 men obtained rights to explore part of the eastern ridge. A newspaper notice from the following year reported that they had encountered promising mineralization and intended to continue underground work. Then references to the operation stopped. No large company emerged, no significant production was recorded, and the claim eventually changed hands. The date corresponded almost perfectly with the 1891 marking found inside the old passage. Daniel could not prove the carving belonged to those prospectors, but the possibility provided a simple explanation for the older workings. Before Black Hollow Mining Company arrived in 1906, a small group may have excavated part of the mountain, discovered limited deposits, and abandoned the site when the operation became unprofitable. Their tunnels were forgotten because they never developed into a major mine. Years later, Black Hollow expanded toward the same area, without complete knowledge of what already existed beneath the ridge. The steel door might therefore have been part of that earlier operation. It could have sealed a storage area, another excavation, a ventilation passage, or simply an unstable section. There was no need for an extraordinary explanation. In fact, Michael believed the most likely answer was disappointingly ordinary. Earlier miners encountered dangerous ground and installed a barrier before abandoning the passage. If so, Black Hollow's engineers probably discovered the door while surveying the old workings in October 1928 and decided that opening it offered little benefit compared with the risk. Whitmore's brief entry supported that interpretation. His notebook showed that by October 12th he was already concerned about structural conditions. The directors wanted information about potential deposits, but even they apparently agreed not to proceed beyond the seal point. For days later, the chamber survey exposed a much larger problem created by Black Hollow's own undocumented excavation. The old door became irrelevant, but history has a way of making irrelevant objects powerful once their context disappears. If someone had entered Black Hollow without the documents and found the steel door first, it could have become the center of endless stories. Treasure might be imagined behind it. Secret rooms, lost equipment, or unexplained discoveries could be invented to fill the absence of evidence. Daniel realized that this was exactly how abandoned places acquired legends. People were uncomfortable with unanswered questions, so they replaced uncertainty with stories. Black Hollow did not need that. The truth they had already uncovered was stronger. The team documented the door thoroughly and turned back. On the return journey through the chamber, Daniel stopped beside Harold Whitmore's table. The objects looked different now that he understood their significance. The engineer had known the room was about to be sealed. He knew company directors intended to alter the official history. Rather than carrying his original surveys back to an administrative building controlled by management, he left them underground. His decision had seemed hopeless in 1928. Once the stone wall was completed, there was no guarantee anyone would ever see the papers again. Yet, Whitmore chose preservation over destruction. Daniel imagined his final visit to the chamber. The mine above him was already silent. Ordinary crews had been dismissed. Houses in the settlement were preparing for departure. A small eastern team was transporting stone and cement through Section 14. Whitmore placed a survey inside the metal cylinder, arranged notebooks, and selected records on the table, then walked out through the narrow passage knowing workers would soon build a wall behind him. Perhaps he expected inspectors to return within months. Perhaps he hoped a future owner would reopen the mine. Perhaps he simply could not bring himself to destroy evidence of what had happened. Whatever his intention, the chamber became an accidental archive. Outside the wall, Black Hollow's history was rewritten. Inside, the original version remained. The team passed through the opening in the 1928 barrier and returned to Section 14. Daniel looked again at the metal plate embedded in the stones. Sealed, October 1928. When they first found it, the inscription seemed ominous. Now it appeared almost administrative. The workers who constructed the wall may not have understood the full story. They were probably following orders, completing one final assignment before leaving the mine forever. Some may have been among the 23 men later paid additional compensation. Daniel wondered what those workers thought while stacking the final stones. They had spent weeks reopening an old passage in search of something valuable. Instead, their work helped expose conditions that ended their own employment and destroyed the settlement where many of their families lived. Then management asked them to help seal the evidence and remain silent. For them, Black Hollow's secret probably did not feel mysterious. It felt like losing everything. The group continued toward the main junction. When the faded number 14 appeared above them again, Daniel stopped to photograph it one final time. This simple painted marking represented one of the clearest examples of how easily an official record could become more powerful than physical reality. For 97 years, historians studying surviving company maps would have concluded that Section 14 never existed. Yet hundreds of feet of tunnel rails, electrical equipment, gates, and an entire underground chamber remained inside the mountain. The map had lied. The mountain had not. Back at the surface, daylight felt unusually bright after hours underground. The forest surrounding the entrance was silent, except for wind moving through leaves. Nothing visible from outside suggested the complexity beneath their feet. A person walking through the valley could pass within yards of the old mine without realizing that an industrial network extended through the mountain. Daniel looked toward the area where Black Hollow settlement once stood. He now understood why so little remained. The disappearance had occurred in stages. First, the workers were removed from the mine. Then families were removed from company housing. Then machinery disappeared from the surface. Railway service ended. Buildings were abandoned or dismantled. Maps stopped identifying Black Hollow as an active settlement. The company dissolved. Witnesses scattered. Documents vanished. And finally, vegetation covered the physical remains. No single act erased Black Hollow. Time completed what management began. During the following months, Daniel and Rebecca organized the evidence chronologically. Their goal was not to produce a sensational story, but to distinguish what could be demonstrated from what remained uncertain. They could demonstrate that Section 14 existed despite being absent from final maps. They could demonstrate that a chamber containing older workings was discovered before the closure. They could show that company engineers identified unauthorized excavation and structural concerns. They had evidence that Whitmore recommended disclosure, and that directors resisted it. Financial records supported unusual payments to members of the Eastern crew. Property records showed questionable activity beyond company boundaries. Surface survey markers confirmed engineers monitored ground movement around the settlement. Together, those facts created a remarkably consistent explanation. Black Hollow Mining Company had spent years extracting valuable material aggressively, including from areas that were either unauthorized or structurally important. In 1928, management reopened an older eastern passage, hoping to investigate a potential opportunity. Instead, engineers discovered forgotten workings that allowed them to see how extensive the company's undocumented excavation had become. Chief Engineer Harold Whitmore concluded that important support structures had been compromised. Measurements suggested movement was occurring. On October 17th, a small underground event confirmed his concerns, and the mine was evacuated. The company then faced consequences that could destroy it financially and legally. Management chose permanent closure. The decision protected workers from returning to a potentially unstable operation, but also protected executives from immediate scrutiny. Section 14 was removed from maps. Selected workers were compensated and required to sign agreements. The chamber containing evidence was sealed. The settlement was emptied. The public was told only that geological conditions had made Black Hollow unsafe. That explanation survived because it contained enough truth to sound complete. The mine really had become unsafe. What the company concealed was its role in making it unsafe. Daniel found that distinction more disturbing than any legend about hidden treasure could have been. Black Hollow demonstrated how easily responsibility could disappear when the people controlling the records also controlled the explanation. Had Whitmore not preserved his notes, future investigators might have found Section 14 and still struggled to prove what happened. The tunnel alone could not reveal who authorized unauthorized extraction or when management learned about the danger. The notebook gave the ruins a voice. Near the end of his research, Daniel returned once more to Thomas Bell's original notebook. The pages that started everything now seemed almost prophetic. Bell had possessed only fragments, yet his instincts were remarkably accurate. He noticed that Section 14 was treated differently. He recorded the guards. He saw the nighttime deliveries. He learned about the chamber. He watched materials being transported underground after the evacuation. And finally, he rejected the explanation everyone else was being asked to accept. The mountain didn't close the mine. They did. Daniel finally understood exactly what Bell meant. Nature had provided the mountain. Earlier miners had created unknown cavities. Geology had produced pressure, but human decisions transformed those conditions into Black Hollow's crisis. The final irony was that the company had tried to make the mountain carry the blame. For 97 years, it worked. And even after the truth was reconstructed, one small part of Black Hollow remained beyond explanation. The steel door. Daniel deliberately left it that way. Not every closed door needed to be opened to understand the room around it. The mystery that mattered had already been solved. Black Hollow had not hidden a secret because nobody searched deeply enough. It had hidden a secret because people with money, authority, and control over the records had worked deliberately to bury it. The wall kept that secret for nearly a century. The door could keep its own. By the time winter settled over the valley at the end of 1928, Black Hollow was already becoming something its residents had never imagined, a place without a future. Only months earlier, nearly 800 people had depended directly or indirectly on the mine. Families had expected to remain for years. Children attended the company school, merchants stocked their shelves according to miners' paydays, and railway schedules connected the isolated settlement with communities beyond the mountains. Then everything stopped. The mine whistle disappeared first. After years of dividing each working day into predictable shifts, its silence became one of the most noticeable signs that Black Hollow had changed. Without the whistle, mornings felt strangely empty. Men who would normally have walked toward the entrance remained at home or left the valleys searching for employment. Railway cars that once carried ore away from the mountain stood unused before eventually being removed. The settlement had been built around movement, noise, and work, and now all three were disappearing at once. Families began leaving almost immediately after receiving final wages. Some had relatives in nearby towns who could offer temporary housing. Others followed rumors of employment at distant mines. The Eastern crew members who received additional company payments had an advantage. Several were able to relocate quickly, carrying enough money to support their families while searching for new work. Ordinary employees had fewer options. Many sold furniture and possessions they could not transport. Company housing had never truly belonged to them, so there was no property to sell when they left. Years of work at Black Hollow had given them stability only as long as the mine remained open. Once the company ended operations, the homes they had treated as permanent became temporary shelters with approaching deadlines. The school remained open briefly because dozens of families had not yet departed, but attendance declined every week. A classroom that once held 30 children might have fewer than 10 by November. Teachers watched familiar desks become empty as families left without knowing whether they would ever see one another again. The general store reduced inventory because there was no reason to order supplies for customers who were disappearing. The clinic stopped regular operations. The boarding house lost almost all its residents. By Christmas, sections of Black Hollow that had once been crowded after every shift were almost completely silent. Thomas Bell was among those who left before the harshest part of winter. He packed what his family could carry and traveled toward a town where another industrial company had offered him temporary work. Bell took his notebook with him, but he left behind tools and personal objects still inside the mine. He would never return for them. During the journey, his children reportedly asked when they would go back to Black Hollow. Bell told them they would not. Whatever suspicion he carried about Section 14, protecting his family now mattered more than proving what the company had done. Harold Whitmore left under very different circumstances. Company records showed his employment ended shortly after the Eastern Barrier was completed. No public announcement explained why the chief engineer departed. Daniel Mercer suspected the conflict recorded in Whitmore's notebook had made continued employment impossible. Whitmore had demanded disclosure. Directors wanted silence. He refused to sign at least one version of the company's explanation and preserved original engineering documents behind the wall. By November, there was little reason for either side to maintain the relationship. Whitmore never became a public whistleblower. That initially disappointed Daniel. If the engineer knew so much, why had he not gone directly to authorities after leaving Black Hollow? The answer may have been complicated. Whitmore could have feared legal consequences for himself. As chief engineer, investigators might ask why dangerous conditions developed under his supervision. He might also have lacked evidence once company records were taken from his control. The strongest documents were hidden underground, and revealing their location would require admitting that he deliberately concealed company material. He had a family and a career to consider. The same pressures that silenced ordinary miners could silence an engineer. There was another possibility. Whitmore may have tried. Rebecca discovered correspondence in the state archive referring to an anonymous inquiry received in early 1929 concerning irregular mine plans and unreported Eastern workings at a recently closed operation. The mine was not named in the surviving page, and the rest of the correspondence appeared to be missing. An official wrote that further investigation was unnecessary because the operation had ceased and no injuries had been reported. Daniel could not prove Whitmore sent the inquiry, but the timing was difficult to ignore. If he had attempted to alert authorities anonymously, the response demonstrated why the company's strategy worked so effectively. Black Hollow was already closed. Nobody had died. The workers were leaving. Inspectors had many active mines demanding attention. Investigating an abandoned operation owned by a company preparing to dissolve offered little immediate benefit. The absence of disaster protected the people responsible. Within 2 years, Black Hollow Mining Company formally ceased to exist. Assets were sold through several transactions, but the mountain property remained tied to companies connected with former investors for much longer. Valuable surface machinery was removed. Smaller equipment inside the mine remained abandoned because recovering it would require reopening the sealed entrance. Company documents were distributed among legal offices, investors, and storage facilities. Some survived, many did not. Section 14 disappeared almost completely from the paper record. The final maps showed only 13 numbered sections. The Eastern Passage ended far earlier than it did physically. The chamber did not exist. The older workings did not exist. The wall did not exist. Anyone studying those plans would conclude that Black Hollow's underground network was smaller and simpler than reality. Above ground, the settlement continued shrinking. By 1930, only a handful of residents remained. Henry Lawson, the elderly former employee who refused to leave his house, became one of the last. Lawson had worked at Black Hollow since its early years and apparently believed the company had no right to force him away simply because the mine closed. For months, representatives tried to persuade him to relocate. Eventually, they offered a payment large enough that he accepted. Why the company cared about one elderly man living in an abandoned settlement puzzled Daniel until he compared Lawson's house with Whitmore's surface map. The property stood close to the projected influence zone. Perhaps it was coincidence. Or perhaps management wanted every resident removed from areas engineers had once considered uncertain. After Lawson left, several remaining structures were dismantled. Others were allowed to deteriorate naturally. Without people repairing roofs, clearing drainage channels, or maintaining roads, decay accelerated. Snow entered buildings through broken windows. Summer vegetation grew across porches. Trees emerged beside foundations. Sections of the old road became difficult to travel. Then nature began doing what the company could never have accomplished alone. It erased the evidence of everyday life. By the 1940s, younger residents of nearby communities knew Black Hollow mainly as an abandoned mining area. Stories circulated about empty houses and equipment left beneath the mountain, but details of the 1928 closure were already becoming uncertain. Some believed an underground explosion had killed workers. Others said flooding destroyed the mine. A few repeated the official story about geological instability. None mentioned Section 14. The 23 Eastern crew members were scattered too widely to preserve a shared account. Some remained miners. Others changed professions. Several died relatively young from ordinary illnesses or workplace conditions common to their generation. Their children grew up in different communities and rarely understood why Black Hollow mattered. Edward Mallory, the worker who refused to sign the company's acknowledgement, never became the public witness Daniel hoped to find. After his railway station arrest, he moved away and worked construction. Family records suggested he struggled financially for several years. There was no evidence that he ever repeated his accusation publicly. Samuel Carter kept his silence. William Hayes kept his silence. Thomas Bell kept his notebook. Harold Whitmore kept the evidence underground. Those separate decisions determined what history remembered. Then came the gradual movement Whitmore had feared. Historical aerial photographs taken decades apart showed subtle changes along the eastern hillside. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no enormous collapse capable of attracting national attention. Instead, a broad depression appeared gradually above the old workings. Trees leaned at unusual angles in one area, and drainage patterns shifted slightly. Michael Reeves believed underground cavities may have compressed or partially failed over many years, allowing the surface to settle. If houses had remained there, cracks might have appeared in foundations. If railway tracks had remained, alignment might have changed. If hundreds of people still lived in Black Hollow, someone would have investigated, but there was nobody left to notice. The settlement's disappearance concealed the physical evidence of the mine's instability almost as effectively as the altered maps concealed Section 14. This was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire story for Daniel. The company had not needed to predict exactly what the mountain would do. By removing people from the area, management removed observers. Any gradual change became part of an abandoned landscape. Decades later, forests covered the depression. Black Hollow became peaceful. Visitors occasionally reached the ruins, but most stayed near the foundations of surface buildings. The mine entrance was difficult to locate, and the concrete barrier discouraged anyone who found it. Stories about the place became increasingly imaginative as factual knowledge disappeared. Some claimed miners had been trapped inside during the closure. Others described hidden treasure. There were rumors of secret tunnels connecting Black Hollow with distant properties. None of those stories contained the real secret. The truth was less spectacular and more consequential. Nobody had been trapped behind the wall. There was no forgotten fortune waiting inside the chamber. There was no evidence of anything supernatural beneath the mountain. There were only records, maps, measurements, payments, engineering warnings, and decisions. Those things were enough to destroy a town. By the beginning of the 21st century, Black Hollow had almost completed its transformation from community into landscape. Satellite images showed uninterrupted forest across much of the former settlement. Roads appeared only as faint lines. The railway corridor could still be identified in places because vegetation grew differently along the old bed. A few foundations survived beneath leaves. The entrance remained sealed. Section 14 remained dark. Whitmore's table remained untouched. The steel door remained closed. Then Thomas Bell's notebook resurfaced. What followed was not the discovery of a secret that had remained perfectly hidden. Pieces of the truth had always existed. Bell's family possessed one piece. Archives contained another. Property records contained another. The physical mind contained the largest piece. The difficulty was recognizing that they belonged together. Daniel's investigation assembled them, and once assembled, they revealed something the company directors of 1928 could never have anticipated. Their cover-up succeeded because time scattered the evidence, but time also preserved it. The concrete entrance protected the underground equipment from casual visitors. The wall protected Whitmore's papers. The abandoned valley protected the survey markers. Bell's family protected his notebook. The forgotten railway archive protected the Section 14 diagram. Objects that seemed destined to disappear survived in different places for nearly a century. Daniel returned to Black Hollow after completing most of the research and stood where the main road once passed through the settlement. Without historical photographs, he would have struggled to imagine hundreds of people there. He knew approximately where the school had stood. He could identify the foundation of the administrative building. Farther through the trees was the route families followed when leaving after the closure. He thought about how Black Hollow had been remembered, a failed mine, an abandoned town, a place defeated by geology. All three descriptions were technically true, but none were complete. Black Hollow was also the story of what happened when short-term success became more important than acknowledging risk. The company extracted more, produced more, and earned more while the physical margin beneath the operation quietly disappeared. When engineers finally saw the consequences, management chose evacuation rather than continued danger. That decision probably protected lives. Then management made another decision. Instead of admitting why the danger existed, it erased the evidence. That decision protected reputations. For 97 years, history confused the two. Daniel looked toward the mountain. Somewhere behind the trees was the sealed entrance. Beyond it were the abandoned rails. Beyond those rails was the junction marked 14. Farther still was the wall. And behind the wall was a wooden table where Harold Whitmore had left the records he believed might someday matter. They had mattered. The company succeeded in making Black Hollow disappear. It failed only in one respect. It could not make the truth disappear with it. By the time Daniel Mercer completed the reconstruction of Black Hollow, the investigation had become much larger than the mystery that first drew him to the valley. In the beginning, there had been a simple question. Why would a profitable mine suddenly close in October 1928 and then disappear so completely from local history? Thomas Bell's notebook offered the first clue. Section 14 provided physical confirmation. Harold Whitmore's hidden records supplied the explanation. But the complete story could only be understood by combining all of those pieces with the lives of the people who had once depended on the mine. Black Hollow had not disappeared in a single afternoon. The process began underground, moved through company offices, reached the houses surrounding the mountain, and then continued quietly for decades until almost nothing remained except trees, concrete foundations, and a sealed entrance that most people no longer knew how to find. Daniel decided that the most important part of the discovery was not the steel door or even the chamber itself. Those objects were visually dramatic, but they could easily distract from what the evidence actually showed. The chamber mattered because it contained records that had been removed from the official history. Section 14 mattered because its physical existence proved company maps had been altered. The surface markers mattered because they demonstrated that engineers had monitored ground movement before and after the evacuation. Together, they transformed Black Hollow from an abandoned mining mystery into a documented example of how a powerful organization could control a story simply by controlling what information survived. The official version had been remarkably effective because it was not entirely false. Geological movement really had occurred. Engineers really did consider parts of the mine unsafe. Evacuating the workers really was a responsible decision once the danger became clear. If the company had invented a completely fictional explanation, contradictions might have exposed it quickly. Instead, management selected one true part of the story and removed everything that made the truth damaging. They did not mention unauthorized excavation. They did not mention missing supports. They did not mention that the eastern workings crossed beyond the company's legal boundary. They did not mention Whitmore's earlier warnings. They did not mention the surface measurements or the older passages beneath the mountain. Most importantly, they did not mention responsibility. Nature became the explanation because nature could not defend itself. The mountain could not testify. The mountain could not produce maps. The mountain could not tell investigators which support structures had been removed or which production supervisor had authorized additional extraction. So Black Hollow Mining Company blamed the mountain and walked away. Daniel found himself returning repeatedly to Whitmore's final sentence. They will call it the mountain's fault. The engineer had understood exactly what would happen. He had watched company directors reduce years of human decisions to a vague geological event. He knew that once the mine was sealed and workers scattered, almost nobody would possess enough information to challenge that explanation. Yet Whitmore had done something extraordinary in its simplicity. He kept the original records. He did not publish them. He did not send them to a newspaper. He did not successfully force an investigation. He placed them inside a chamber and allowed a wall to rise between them and the outside world. For decades, that decision seemed useless. Then it became the reason the truth survived. Rebecca Shaw eventually reconstructed the probable final days of Whitmore's involvement using his notebook, payroll records, and company correspondence. On October 25, 1928, Whitmore made what was likely his final visit to the chamber. He carried original surveys and selected engineering notes into Section 14. Some documents may have been hidden inside the metal cylinder specifically because he expected moisture to damage ordinary paper. He left his notebook among them. The following day, workers began closing the passage. Daniel imagined Whitmore walking out for the final time. He would have passed the old tool marks in the eastern tunnel, crossed the unfinished section of railway, and reached the guarded junction. Behind him was evidence capable of challenging the company's public story. Ahead of him was a settlement already beginning to empty. Perhaps he turned around. Perhaps he did not. History rarely preserves moments like that. What survived was a result. The wall was completed. The chamber disappeared. Then Section 14 disappeared from maps. But the physical tunnel remained. The distinction fascinated Daniel. Paper could be changed quickly. A line could be removed from a drawing in seconds. A report could be rewritten. A public statement could omit inconvenient facts. Physical reality was more stubborn. Hundreds of feet of rail could not vanish simply because a map no longer showed them. A tunnel did not cease to exist because company directors stopped acknowledging it. That was ultimately why the cover-up failed. The company could alter the record. It could not alter the mountain enough to match the record. Nearly a century later, Daniel had walked directly through the contradiction. He had stood at a junction where the map showed solid rock and looked into Section 14. He had followed rails the official plan said were never installed. He had reached a wall the closure report never mentioned. Then he had crossed into a chamber that company history had erased. Every step deeper into Black Hollow had moved farther away from the official version and closer to the physical truth. Michael Reeves remained cautious about one point. He did not want later retellings to exaggerate how close Black Hollow came to catastrophe. Whitmore's records demonstrated legitimate concern, but they did not prove the entire settlement would have suddenly disappeared into the ground. The slow depression visible in later aerial photographs suggested gradual settlement was more likely than one enormous collapse. That distinction mattered. The company's wrongdoing did not need exaggeration to be serious. Management had allowed mining to continue without accurate structural records, and then concealed why engineers eventually considered the operation unsafe. The truth was powerful enough without turning it into legend. Daniel agreed. That principle influenced how he treated the steel door. Public fascination naturally focused on it once the team documented the passage. A mysterious, unopened door inside older working seemed more exciting than engineering maps and payroll records. People wanted to know what was behind it. Some imagined another chamber. Others suggested equipment, documents, or valuable minerals. Daniel refused to speculate. The door remained closed. The surrounding passage remained unstable. There was no historical reason strong enough to justify disturbing it. More importantly, opening it was unnecessary. The central mystery of Black Hollow had already been answered. The secret was not behind the final door. The secret had been sitting on Whitmore's table. It had been written in measurements and dates. Black Hollow had been damaged not by one dramatic accident, but by years of choices that accumulated underground until the consequences became impossible to ignore. That realization changed how Daniel viewed the abandoned settlement. On his first visit, The ruins seemed empty. After the investigation, they felt crowded with invisible history. A rectangular foundation among trees was no longer simply concrete. It had once supported a school where children attended classes on October 17th, without knowing their fathers were being evacuated underground. A depression in the forest had once been a road where families carried belongings toward a railway after being told they had to leave. A rusted metal fragment belonged to a transportation system that once moved tons of or every day. The valley had not always been silent. People had laughed there, argued there, raised children there, planned futures there. Then decisions made inside company offices removed the reason for the community to exist. Black Hollow's disappearance became even more powerful when Daniel considered how ordinary the beginning had been. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to destroy a town. The process likely started years earlier with smaller compromises. A little additional or removed from a restricted area. A map not updated immediately. A production supervisor choosing output over engineering caution. Another excavation extending slightly beyond a legal boundary. Each decision could be justified individually. Together, they changed a mountain. By the time Whitmore discovered the full pattern, reversing it was impossible. The rock could not be put back. The removed supports could not simply be restored. The undocumented cavities could not be erased. Management could only decide what happened next. It chose to close the mine. Then it chose to close the story. The first decision ended Black Hollow's economy. The second created its mystery. Almost 97 years later, the valley remained largely empty. Forests covered most traces of the settlement, and the mountain showed no obvious sign of the tunnels inside it. To anyone passing through without knowledge of the past, Black Hollow was simply another quiet piece of wilderness. Daniel preferred it that way. The investigation did not require turning the site into an attraction. The mine remained dangerous, and the physical ruins were fragile. What mattered was preserving the history rather than encouraging people to enter the tunnels. Thomas Bell's notebook was eventually stored more carefully. Whitmore's recovered records were documented. The maps were compared and preserved. The names of the 23 Eastern workers were recorded together for the first time in generations. Those men had spent most of history as anonymous participants in a mystery they were forbidden to explain. Daniel believed they deserved to be remembered differently. They had not created the decisions that closed Black Hollow. They were workers following instructions inside a system controlled by people far above them. Some accepted money. Some signed agreements. At least one refused. Most simply moved on because they had families to feed. Their silence had preserved a secret, but that did not necessarily make them responsible for it. Thomas Bell demonstrated the difference. He never publicly challenged the company, yet he recorded what he saw. His notebook waited. Whitmore did the same. Two men with very different positions inside Black Hollow independently preserved fragments of truth without knowing whether anyone would ever connect them. Nearly a century later, those fragments met. Daniel returned to the valley one final time near the anniversary of the closure. Autumn had begun changing the forest, and leaves covered the remains of the old railway bed. He followed the route toward the mine, but stopped before reaching the entrance. There was no reason to go underground again. He already knew what was there. Instead, he walked toward the former settlement and found the approximate location of the school. Nothing recognizable remained except part of a foundation beneath vegetation. He stood there and looked toward the mountain. 97 years earlier, families standing in approximately the same place had watched miners emerge unexpectedly in the middle of the day. They did not know why. 3 days later, they learned the mine would never reopen. Within months, many were gone. Within years, almost everyone was gone. Within decades, the reason was gone too. Daniel thought about how close the truth had come to disappearing completely. If Margaret Bell had thrown away her grandfather's notebook, Section 14 might have remained a meaningless discrepancy. If the forgotten railway diagram had been discarded, Bell's number could have been dismissed as an error. If the entrance had collapsed completely, nobody might have reached the eastern junction. If moisture had destroyed Whitmore's cylinder, the most important engineering survey could have vanished. History survived through a chain of accidents. The company had controlled almost everything in 1928. It could not control the next 97 years. Daniel left the valley before sunset. Behind him, Black Hollow returned to silence. The abandoned entrance remained beneath the mountain. The rails remained in darkness. Section 14 remained where the maps once said Solid Rock should be. The stone wall remained as evidence of the attempt to bury what happened. And deeper inside, the steel door remained closed. There would always be unanswered questions beneath Black Hollow, but the most important question no longer belonged among them. The world finally knew why the mine had closed. The company had blamed the mountain. The workers had carried fragments of another story. And for almost a century, the evidence waited underground for someone to bring those fragments together. Black Hollow had been abandoned. Its records had been altered. Its people had been scattered. Its tunnels had been sealed. But the mountain remembered. For almost 97 years, Black Hollow existed in the space between history and forgetting. The official explanation was simple enough that few people had reason to question it. A mining company entered a mountain. Geological conditions became dangerous. Operations stopped, and the community surrounding the mine gradually disappeared. It was the kind of story repeated across countless abandoned industrial towns. Businesses failed. Resources disappeared. Workers moved elsewhere. Buildings collapsed. Roads vanished beneath vegetation. And eventually only photographs remained to prove that hundreds of people had once lived where forests later grew. If Thomas Bell's notebook had never survived, Black Hollow might remain exactly that. Another abandoned place with an incomplete history and a concrete wall covering the entrance to a mine nobody had reason to reopen. But Bell noticed something that the official story could not explain. He saw a guard standing hundreds of feet underground. He watched equipment being transported toward a passage that was supposed to have been abandoned years earlier. He recorded the existence of Section 14, even though later company maps insisted there were only 13 sections. He heard that workers had discovered a chamber behind the eastern wall. Then he watched more than 100 miners leave Black Hollow in the middle of an ordinary working day and never return. Bell did not possess Harold Whitmore's calculations or the company's hidden surveys. He could not know precisely what management had discovered beneath the mountain, but he understood enough to leave behind one sentence that eventually became the foundation of the entire investigation. The mountain didn't close the mine. They did. Decades passed before anyone understood how accurate those words were. Daniel Mercer began with an old notebook and a discrepancy on a map. That discrepancy led him to a forgotten engineering diagram. The diagram led back to the mountain. Inside Black Hollow, the official history began failing almost immediately. The equipment abandoned beside the tracks demonstrated how suddenly workers had left. The hidden junction proved that surviving maps were incomplete. The faded number 14 confirmed Bell had described a real section. The restricted gate showed that management had deliberately controlled access. And at the end of the passage stood the strongest evidence of all, a wall constructed by human hands and marked October 1928. Behind that wall, the mountain preserved what the company tried to remove from history. Harold Whitmore's engineering survey showed underground workings crossing boundaries absent from official plans. His notebook described support structures that had been reduced or removed, older cavities that complicated the eastern side of the mine, and measurements suggesting the surrounding rock was beginning to respond. His entries recorded arguments with management, recommendations to stop work, and demands that authorities be informed. The directors refused disclosure. Then, after the movement of October 17 confirmed Whitmore's concerns, Black Hollow was evacuated. That part of the company's decision may have protected lives. What happened afterward protected the company. Workers assigned to the eastern section received unusual payments. Agreements discouraged them from discussing what they had seen. Section 14 disappeared from later maps. Construction crews sealed the chamber. The main entrance was closed behind stone and concrete. Families were encouraged to leave the settlement. Company property remained under controlled ownership rather than being sold freely. Eventually, the corporation dissolved, and the people capable of comparing memories scattered across the country. Black Hollow did not disappear because everyone forgot at the same moment. It disappeared because the pieces of its story were separated. One worker knew about the guards. Another knew about the chamber. Another knew about the agreements. Thomas Bell knew the maps were wrong. Harold Whitmore knew why. None of them alone could reconstruct everything. Time completed the separation. Then, nearly a century later, those pieces came back together. The greatest irony was that the wall designed to conceal the evidence also helped preserve it. Whitmore understood that company records above ground could be altered or destroyed, so he left original material inside the very chamber management intended to isolate. The barrier protected those documents from decades of disturbance. The abandoned entrance discouraged visitors. The darkness beneath the mountain became an archive nobody knew existed. When the chamber was finally reached again, there was no treasure waiting on the other side. There did not need to be. The documents were more valuable to the history of Black Hollow than gold could have been. They restored responsibility to a story from which responsibility had been carefully removed. The mountain had moved, but human decisions had helped create the conditions behind that movement, and that difference mattered. Today, almost nothing remains of the community that once surrounded Black Hollow. The houses have disappeared. The school exists only through photographs and foundations hidden beneath vegetation. The railway that carried Orway from the valley is broken and overgrown. Trees stand where miners once walked toward the entrance before sunrise. If someone crossed the area without knowing its history, there would be little reason to imagine that hundreds of people once built their lives there. Beneath the surface, however, Black Hollow still exists. The rails remain. The junction remains. Section 14 remains. The wall remains. The chamber remains. And at the far end of the older workings, one steel door remains closed. Perhaps one day conditions will allow historians to determine what exists beyond it. Perhaps it leads only to another abandoned 19th century passage. Perhaps there is nothing behind it worth remembering at all. For now, it does not matter, because the most important secret of Black Hollow was never behind that door. It was hidden in the decisions made before the mine closed. A company pushed deeper into the mountain because deeper meant more, or records stopped matching reality. Boundaries were crossed. Supports disappeared. Warnings accumulated. Then the consequences became impossible to ignore. And when management finally understood what had happened, it faced a choice between revealing the truth and controlling the story. It controlled the story. For 97 years, that choice worked. Black Hollow became another abandoned mine, supposedly defeated by nature. The people responsible disappeared from memory. The workers died without seeing the full truth revealed, and the forest slowly covered what remained of their town. But history has a strange way of surviving. Sometimes it survives in official archives, sometimes in photographs, sometimes in letters passed through families, and sometimes it survives half a mile inside a mountain, behind a wall built specifically to make sure nobody ever sees it again. Black Hollow was supposed to remain silent. Instead, nearly a century later, the silence became the reason someone finally listened. And after 97 years, the mountain gave back the secret it had been forced to keep. If the story of Black Hollow proves anything, it is that abandoned places are not always empty. Sometimes the buildings disappear, the roads vanish, and the people move away, but something remains behind. A document, a forgotten photograph, a name on an old map, or a tunnel that official records say should not exist. And sometimes all it takes is one person asking the right question to bring an entire forgotten story back into the light. If you enjoyed this journey into a place history nearly erased, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories of forgotten expeditions, abandoned places, and mysteries that remained hidden for generations. And tell us in the comments, if you were standing inside Black Hollow at the end of that forgotten passage, would you want to know what was behind the final steel door, or would you leave it exactly as it was? Because somewhere in the world, there is another forgotten place waiting beneath the dust, the forest, or the earth, and its story may not be over yet.